While cowboys dodged bullets for $30 a month, one group of workers earned $120, triple the pay for triple the terror. What made grown men choose certain death over relative safety? The answer will disturb you. The Wild West wasn't just dangerous because of famous gunfights you see in movies. The real danger came from something much simpler. There were barely any rules, and even fewer people to enforce them. Most frontier towns started as temporary camps. Miners would rush in looking for gold, cowboys would drive cattle through, and railroad workers would lay tracks before moving on to the next job. Nobody planned to stick around long enough to build proper courts or hire real police officers. Why bother with law and order when you might pack up and leave next month? When disputes happened, people settled them the fastest way possible. Got a problem with your neighbor stealing your horse? You didn't file a complaint with the sheriff. You grabbed your gun and handled it yourself. Someone cheating at cards in the saloon. The other players didn't call for a judge. They either threw punches or started shooting. Towns that did try to establish law enforcement faced a brutal reality. Finding someone willing to pin on a badge meant finding someone ready to die for it. The job paid poorly, attracted enemies, and came with a life expectancy shorter than a candle in a windstorm. Many sheriffs were just regular folks who got volunteered by their neighbors, handed a rusty gun, and told to keep the peace. Talk about learning on the job. The lack of communication made everything worse. If a gang robbed a bank in one town, it could take weeks for word to reach neighboring settlements. By then the outlaws had long since moved on to their next target. No telephones, no radios, no quick way to warn anyone about approaching danger. You were on your own. Distance played a huge role too. Help might be days or even weeks away. If trouble started, you couldn't just call for backup. The nearest real lawman could be 100 miles away, dealing with his own problems. This isolation forced people to take justice into their own hands, which often meant more violence instead of less. Then there's the simple fact that everyone carried weapons. Guns weren't just for outlaws and lawmen. Farmers, shopkeepers, traveling salesmen, even school teachers packed iron. When everyone's armed and there's no police force to break up fights, arguments tend to escalate quickly. What might have been a shouting match in a civilized town became a deadly shootout on the frontier. The legal system, when it existed at all, was rough and ready. Judges were often just respected community members, with no legal training. Trials happened fast, sometimes within hours of an arrest. Punishments were harsh and immediate. Guilty of horse theft, you might be swinging from a tree by sunset. Due process was a luxury frontier towns couldn't afford. Mining camps were especially lawless. Thousands of men would flood into an area after hearing rumors of gold or silver strikes. These weren't permanent communities with families and churches to provide stability. They were collections of desperate armed strangers competing for the same prize. Claim jumping, card cheating, and outright robbery were daily occurrences. Murder was so common that some camps averaged one killing per day during peak periods. Cattle towns weren't much better. When cowboys finished months-long drives, they arrived in town with money burning holes in their pockets and enough pent-up energy to power a steam engine. They wanted whiskey, gambling, and entertainment, and they wanted it loud. Mix alcohol with armed men who've been sleeping under stars for months, and you get explosive results. But here's what made the Wild West truly dangerous. It attracted people running from something. Criminals fled west to escape eastern law enforcement. Debtors headed for the frontier to dodge creditors. Men with dark pasts saw the lawless territories as fresh starts where nobody asked too many questions about your history. This meant frontier towns were packed with people who had reasons to avoid the law. Natural dangers added another layer of risk. Flash floods could wipe out entire settlements in minutes. Prairie fires moved faster than horses could run. Blizzards trapped people for days without food or fuel. Disease spread quickly through crowded, unsanitary camps where medical care meant whatever the local barber or blacksmith knew about setting bones. Native American conflicts created constant tension in many areas. Treaties were broken regularly by both sides. Misunderstandings led to raids and reprisals. The army was spread too thin to protect scattered settlements, leaving residents to defend themselves or die trying. Even everyday activities carried deadly risks. Crossing rivers meant possible drowning. Handling horses could result in crushed bones or kicked-in skulls. Simple infections became fatal without proper medicine. Accidents with firearms happened constantly among people who'd never received proper training. The combination of weak law enforcement, armed populations, harsh conditions, and desperate people created a perfect storm of violence. But this dangerous environment also produced some of the most legendary figures in American history. The lawmen who tried to bring order to this chaos faced challenges that would test anyone's courage and skill. Being a lawman in the Wild West wasn't exactly a career you'd find advertised in the local newspaper. Most sheriffs and marshals stumbled into the job because someone had to do it, and frankly, the someone willing to pin a badge on their chest usually had a death wish or desperately needed the money. The average frontier lawman's career lasted less than 5 years. Not because they found better jobs or decided to retire to Florida. They died. Shot in the back, ambushed on dark trails, or simply overwhelmed by gangs who outnumbered them 10-1. The Wild West didn't mess around when it came to ending careers permanently. Consider the sheer geography these men faced. A sheriff might patrol territory the size of modern-day Rhode Island, armed with nothing but a horse, a six-shooter, and whatever backup he could scrape together from local volunteers. When outlaws struck a bank in one town, they'd vanish into canyons, mountains, or endless plains where tracking them meant following cold trails for weeks. Makes sense that most criminals got away, right? Then there's the math problem that kept lawmen awake at night. Bank robbers rarely worked alone. Jesse James rode with a gang, Butch Cassidy had his wild bunch. The Dalton gang terrorized multiple states simultaneously. Meanwhile, the average frontier town had maybe one sheriff and a deputy, who might also run the local barber shop. When 6 armed outlaws rode into town, the odds weren't exactly in law enforcement's favor. But the real danger came from the unexpected moments. Lawmen couldn't predict when a routine arrest would explode into a gunfight. A drunk cowboy refusing to hand over his weapons could turn deadly in seconds. Serving warrants meant knocking on doors not knowing if the person inside had already decided they'd rather die than face trial. Every conversation, every traffic stop, every noise in the night carried the potential for violence. Speed mattered more than accuracy in most shootouts. The lawman who hesitated to draw his weapon usually ended up in the town cemetery. Quick decisions separated the living from the dead, and there wasn't time to consult a manual or call for backup. You either reacted fast enough to survive the encounter, or your deputy would be writing letters to your family. Some lawmen developed reputations that preceded them into dangerous situations. Wild Bill Hickok's name alone sometimes convinced outlaws to surrender without a fight. But fame came with its own set of problems. Every young gunslinger looking to make a name for himself would eventually come looking for the famous sheriff. Celebrity status in the Wild West meant having a target painted on your back permanently. The loneliness of the job slowly drove some lawmen to madness. Months spent tracking criminals across desolate terrain, sleeping under stars, eating cold beans from cans, no radio contact with headquarters, no backup arriving in minutes. Just endless miles of dangerous territory and the constant knowledge that the next ridge might hide an ambush. Well, at least the pay was terrible too. Most frontier lawmen earned less than skilled laborers, assuming the town could afford to pay them at all. Some worked for a percentage of fines collected, which meant no arrests equaled no income. Others survived on rewards for captured outlaws, creating a bounty hunter mentality that sometimes led to shoot first, ask questions later approaches to law enforcement. Training consisted of whatever experience a man brought to the job. Former soldiers had advantages in gunfights, but civilian lawmen learned on the job, or died trying. No police academy, no standardized procedures, no forensic science. Justice often came down to who could draw faster and shoot straighter when the situation went sideways. The psychological pressure was relentless. Every shadow could hide an assassin. Every stranger might be the brother of someone you'd arrested last month seeking revenge. Paranoia became a survival skill rather than a mental illness. Lawmen who lived long enough to retire often suffered from what we'd now recognize as severe PTSD. And the weird part is, some men thrived in this environment. They genuinely enjoyed the chess game of tracking criminals, the adrenaline rush of dangerous confrontations, the respect that came with maintaining order in chaotic frontier towns. These were the lawmen who lasted more than 5 years and became legends. But for every famous sheriff who survived to tell tales, dozens more died nameless deaths in forgotten places. Shot while pursuing horse thieves, killed breaking up saloon fights, ambushed while escorting prisoners to trial. Their graves dot the western landscape like grim reminders of just how dangerous it was to wear a badge. The men who chose to hunt outlaws for a living faced almost identical dangers, except they usually worked alone and answered to no one but themselves. But that's a different kind of dangerous game entirely, one that attracted an even more desperate breed of frontier survivor. Life as an outlaw in the Wild West wasn't some romantic adventure you see in movies. These guys lived like hunted animals, always looking over their shoulders and sleeping with one eye open. Every sunrise could be their last, and they knew it. Most outlaws got into the game thinking they'd strike it rich quick. Rob a few banks, hit some trains, maybe knock over a stagecoach or two, then retire to Mexico with pockets full of gold. Reality had other plans. The money was never as good as they imagined, and staying alive long enough to spend it, that was the real trick. Train robbery looked glamorous, but it was brutally dangerous work. First, you had to stop a massive iron beast moving at full speed without getting crushed. Then there were the armed guards, angry passengers who might fight back, and railroad detectives who'd hunt you to the ends of the earth. Jesse James made it look easy, but for every successful train heist, dozens of wannabe outlaws ended up dead on the tracks. Bank jobs weren't much better. Sure, banks had money, but they also had thick walls, heavy safes, and armed tellers. Small-town banks might only have $50 in the vault after a robbery that could get you hanged. The risk-to-reward ratio was absolutely terrible, but desperate men don't always think clearly about math. Then there's the part nobody talks about much. Outlaws spent most of their time betraying each other. Trust was a luxury they couldn't afford, but they needed partners to pull off big jobs. This created a nasty cycle where gang members constantly plotted against their own teammates. Bob Ford shot Jesse James in the back for reward money. The Reno brothers turned on each other when things got hot. Loyalty lasted exactly as long as it took to count the loot. Living on the run meant never staying anywhere long enough to get comfortable. Outlaws slept in caves, abandoned shacks, or under the stars. They ate whatever they could hunt or steal. Medical care, forget about it. An infected gunshot wound killed plenty of outlaws who survived the actual shootout. They'd patch themselves up with whiskey and dirty bandages, hoping for the best. Law enforcement was getting better organized too. The Pinkerton Detective Agency had resources and patience that local sheriffs couldn't match. These guys would track outlaws for months, building cases and setting traps. They had photographs, detailed descriptions, and informants everywhere. Running from the law wasn't just about outgunning some small-town sheriff anymore. Capture usually meant a quick trial and a rope. Western justice moved fast, especially for known outlaws. Some got lucky and faced years in prison instead of execution, but frontier prisons were hellholes that killed men slowly instead of quickly. Either way, the career path had a pretty definite endpoint. The smart outlaws tried to go straight after a few successful jobs, but legitimate society rarely welcomed former criminals. Once you had a reputation, it followed you everywhere. Wanted posters with your face showed up in every town. Former gang members might rat you out for reward money. Even if you moved to another territory and changed your name, someone usually recognized you eventually. Weather could be just as deadly as bullets. Outlaws hiding in the mountains during winter froze to death regularly. Desert hideouts meant dying of thirst if your water ran out. Flash floods, rattlesnakes, wild animals and disease picked off plenty of criminals that lawmen never caught. Some outlaws became folk heroes after death, but they never got to enjoy the fame. Billy the Kid died at 21. Most of the James Younger gang ended up dead or in prison. Butch Cassidy's wild bunch scattered to the winds, with several members killed in shootouts. The few who survived usually lived in poverty, broken men who'd wasted their lives chasing easy money that never materialized. The irony is thick when you think about it. Outlaws chose crime because regular jobs seemed too dangerous or didn't pay enough. Coal mining, railroad work, cattle driving, all risky occupations with modest wages. But being an outlaw was statistically more likely to get you killed than any legitimate frontier job. At least honest workers could sleep peacefully and didn't have bounty hunters tracking their every move. The average outlaw career lasted maybe 2 years before ending in death or capture. Compare that to how long most people kept regular jobs, and the math gets pretty clear. Crime might have seemed like a shortcut to wealth, but it was actually a fast track to an early grave. While outlaws were busy shooting each other and running from the law, other folks were taking equally dangerous risks just trying to make an honest living. The people who transported goods across dangerous territory faced many of the same threats, but without the luxury of choosing their own schedules or hideouts. The crack of a whip echoed across dusty trails as stagecoach drivers gripped leather reins with calloused hands. These weren't just transportation workers. They were warriors on wheels, battling everything from armed bandits to flash floods, while hauling precious cargo and terrified passengers across hundreds of miles of unforgiving wilderness. Robbery wasn't just a possibility, it was practically guaranteed. Most drivers expected to face at least 3 or 4 holdups during their career, assuming they lived that long. Bandits' new stagecoaches carried mail, money, and wealthy passengers, making them perfect targets. The famous cry, "Stand and deliver," became so common that experienced drivers could spot potential ambush sites from miles away: narrow canyon passes, thick groves of trees, or rocky outcrops where outlaws love to hide. But here's the thing about stagecoach drivers: they weren't sitting ducks. Many were former soldiers, gunfighters, or just plain tough customers who'd rather die fighting than hand over their cargo. They carried rifles, pistols, and sometimes even shotguns loaded with buckshot. Some drivers became legends for their shooting skills, like Cherokee Bill Williams, who supposedly killed 12 bandits during his career without losing a single strongbox. Then there's the matter of the roads themselves. Calling them roads was generous. Most were barely visible trails carved through hostile terrain. Drivers navigated steep mountain passes, where one wrong turn meant plummeting hundreds of feet into rocky gorges. Desert crossings could stretch for days without water, while muddy river bottoms during spring floods turned wheels into anchors. A broken axle in the middle of nowhere wasn't just inconvenient, it could be a death sentence. Weather added another layer of hell to the job. Blizzards in the mountains could bury entire stagecoaches, forcing drivers and passengers to huddle together for warmth while wolves howled in the distance. Summer heat in places like Arizona regularly killed horses mid-journey, leaving drivers stranded with angry passengers and no way forward. Flash floods appeared without warning, turning dry creek beds into raging torrents that could sweep away coaches in seconds. Most stagecoaches employed armed guards called shotgun riders. That's where the phrase "riding shotgun" comes from. These guards weren't there for decoration. They carried double-barreled shotguns loaded with heavy shot that could drop a horse at 50 yards. Good guards could reload while the coach bounced and swayed at full speed, all while scanning the horizon for trouble. The partnership between driver and guard often meant the difference between completing a run or ending up buzzard food. The passengers themselves sometimes created more problems than bandits. Wealthy Eastern gentlemen who'd never fired a gun in their lives would panic during attacks, getting in the way or accidentally shooting their own protectors. Women in elaborate dresses made quick escapes impossible. Drunks started fights, gamblers attracted trouble, and everyone complained about the bone-jarring ride over roads that could shake your teeth loose. Wildlife posed constant threats beyond human outlaws. Bears wandered onto trails, spooking horses into deadly stampedes. Rattlesnakes coiled in wagon ruts, striking at anything that moved. Mountain lions stalked coaches through narrow passes, and packs of wolves followed the scent of horses for miles. Drivers learned to carry extra ammunition, not just for bandits, but for the four-legged predators that saw stagecoaches as mobile buffets. The average stagecoach driver lasted about 3 years on the job. Those weren't retirement numbers. That's how long most survived before bullets, accidents, or sheer exhaustion claimed them. Companies like Wells Fargo paid well because they had to. The job killed people faster than they could hire replacements. Starting wages might reach $100 per month, huge money when most workers earned $20, but every dollar came with blood attached. Equipment failures happened constantly and catastrophically. Wheels split on rocks, leaving coaches tilted at dangerous angles. Harnesses snapped during river crossings, sending horses swimming free while passengers screamed. Brakes failed on steep mountain descents, turning controlled rides into terrifying death races toward cliff edges. Drivers carried repair tools, but fixing a broken coach while bandits circled wasn't exactly ideal working conditions. Some drivers became folk heroes for their incredible survival stories. Charlie Parkhurst drove for over 20 years, surviving countless attacks and accidents before retiring wealthy and respected. Only after death did people discover Charlie was actually Charlotte, a woman who'd disguised herself as a man to work one of the most dangerous jobs in the West. Communication between way stations could take days, meaning drivers often rode into trouble with no warning. A burned-out station might mean no fresh horses for the next 50 miles. Missing guards could indicate recent Indian raids or bandit activity. Smart drivers learned to read these signs like a deadly alphabet written in blood and ashes. The bravest souls who lasted long in stagecoach driving developed almost supernatural skills. They could sense ambushes, predict weather changes, and navigate by stars when trails disappeared. But even the best eventually faced something they couldn't outrun, outshoot, or outmaneuver. While stagecoach drivers battled human and natural enemies along established routes, another group of frontier workers faced an even more isolated existence on the endless grasslands, hunting the massive beasts that ruled the plains. Lawmen got most of the attention. But there was another group facing death every single day on the frontier. Buffalo hunters. These men ventured into the vast, empty plains where nature itself tried to kill them before breakfast. The Great Plains stretched endlessly in every direction. No trees for shelter, no towns for hundreds of miles. Just grass, wind, and millions of buffalo waiting to be shot. Hunters loaded massive rifles that could drop a 2,000-pound bull from half a mile away. The Sharps, 50 caliber rifle became their weapon of choice. A gun so powerful it could knock a man flat on his back if he wasn't ready for the kick. But here's the thing about buffalo hunting that most people never understood. The real danger wasn't the buffalo themselves, though they could certainly trample you to death. The real killer was everything else. Winter on the plains could freeze a man solid in his sleep. Temperatures dropped to 30 below zero with winds that cut through any coat like it was made of paper. Hunters built crude shelters from buffalo hides and prayed the wind wouldn't blow them away. Some mornings they'd wake up buried under 3 feet of snow with no idea which direction led to civilization. Then summer arrived like a furnace. Heat waves shimmered off the grassland, making it impossible to see straight. Water became more precious than gold. Many hunters died of thirst just yards away from a stream they couldn't spot through the heat haze. The smart ones learned to follow buffalo trails to water sources, but even that wasn't foolproof. Speaking of water, let's talk about what else lived on those plains. Wolves traveled in packs of 20 or more, and they weren't afraid of humans. A hungry wolf pack could surround a hunter's camp at night and wait for him to make one mistake. Bears wandered down from the mountains, and a grizzly bear could tear through a buffalo hide shelter like tissue paper. The buffalo themselves presented their own special kind of terror. A good hunter could drop 50 buffalo in one morning without moving from his shooting position, but sometimes the herd would panic. When 5,000 buffalo decide to run in the same direction, everything in their path gets crushed into the dirt. Hunters learned to position themselves upwind and pray the wind didn't shift, because one whiff of human scent could send the entire herd charging straight toward them. Professional buffalo hunters developed a system that sounds almost mechanical today. They'd find a herd, set up their shooting stand, and start dropping buffalo one by one. The key was shooting the lead cow first, the one the others followed. Do it right, and the herd would mill around confused while you picked them off methodically. A top hunter like Buffalo Bill Cody could kill over 4,000 buffalo in 18 months. That's more than 7 buffalo every single day. The skinning came next, and that's where things got really messy. A skilled skinner could peel the hide off a buffalo in under 10 minutes, but working that fast with razor-sharp knives led to plenty of accidents. Cut an artery in your wrist while skinning, and you'd bleed out miles from help. The buffalo trade attracted every kind of thief and desperado you can imagine. A wagon full of buffalo hides was worth serious money, making hunters prime targets for robbery. Most hunters worked in teams of 3 or 4, 1 shooter, 2 skinners, and someone to watch for trouble. The watchers carried rifles, and knew how to use them. Because thieves didn't usually ask politely, weather could turn deadly in minutes on the plains. Thunderstorms brought lightning that killed both hunters and buffalo. Flash floods swept away camps that seemed perfectly safe an hour before. Blizzards appeared out of nowhere, and hunters caught in the open had maybe 20 minutes to find shelter before frostbite set in. But the weirdest danger, the buffalo hunters themselves going crazy. Months alone on empty plains with nothing but wind and gunshots for company, drove some men completely insane. They'd start talking to their rifles or claim they could hear buffalo calling their names. More than one hunting party found their partner sitting in camp, staring at nothing, unable to remember his own name. The really successful hunters made enough money in one season to buy a farm back east. The unlucky ones ended up as bleached bones scattered across the prairie, their rifles rusting beside them. Most fell somewhere in between, making enough to survive while slowly wearing down their bodies and minds in one of America's most brutal jobs. The buffalo herds seemed endless, but they weren't. Within 20 years, professional hunters had reduced millions of buffalo to a few hundred scattered survivors. The hunters moved on to other work, but many never adjusted to civilization again. They'd spend the rest of their lives dreaming about those endless plains and the thunder of massive rifles echoing across empty grassland. Railroad workers faced their own brand of frontier danger, but at least they had each other for company. Building a railroad across the American frontier meant dealing with explosives every single day, not carefully measured doses in a laboratory. We're talking about black powder and nitroglycerin handled by men who learned on the job, often with missing fingers as proof of their education. Railroad construction crews faced death from so many angles, it's almost impressive they built anything at all. The Transcontinental Railroad project killed roughly 1 worker for every mile of track laid. That's not an exaggeration for dramatic effect. That's the cold, hard math of frontier construction. Blasting through mountains required tons of explosives, and safety protocols were basically try not to die today. Workers would drill holes into solid rock, stuff them with black powder, light a fuse, and run like hell. Sometimes the fuse burned faster than expected. Sometimes it burned slower, and impatient workers would go back to check on a dud charge that was actually just taking its sweet time. The lucky ones only lost limbs. Then there's nitroglycerin, which was so unstable it could explode if you looked at it wrong. Railroad companies imported this liquid death because it packed more punch than black powder, but transporting it was like playing Russian roulette with chemistry. Wagons carrying nitroglycerin would sometimes just vanish in a cloud of smoke and splinters, taking the driver and horses with them. One small bump in the road could turn a supply run into a crater. Most railroad workers were immigrants, Irish, Chinese, German, men who took these jobs because they needed money desperately enough to risk their lives daily. The Chinese workers on the Central Pacific Railroad got the most dangerous assignments, often because white workers refused to do them. They'd lower each other down cliff faces in wicker baskets to plant explosives in the Sierra Nevada mountains. Wicker baskets, dangling hundreds of feet above jagged rocks while handling unstable explosives. But explosives weren't even the biggest killer. Landslides crushed entire work crews without warning. Mountain construction meant constantly disturbing loose rock and soil that had been stable for centuries. Workers would blast a section, and the vibration would trigger a massive slide somewhere else entirely. Men would be buried under tons of rock and dirt, sometimes while they were sleeping in their camps nearby. Cave-ins happened so frequently that railroad companies kept coffins in stock at construction sites. Not exactly a confidence booster for the workers. Underground tunnels were especially deadly because there was no way to predict when the ceiling would decide to come down. Workers used timber supports, but these were often green wood that would crack under pressure or rot quickly in damp conditions. Railroad companies treated workers like disposable equipment. When someone died, they'd hire a replacement and keep building. Some companies actually calculated death benefits into their construction budgets, setting aside money to pay grieving families. The Central Pacific Railroad paid Chinese families about $60 per death. That was supposed to cover a man's entire life's worth. Weather made everything worse. Building railroads meant working outside in every condition imaginable. Summer heat in the desert could kill men from heat stroke while they handled heavy metal rails and tools. Winter construction meant frostbite and hypothermia, plus the added danger of explosives that became even more unpredictable in extreme cold. The pace of construction was brutal because railroad companies were racing against competitors and government deadlines. The faster they built, the more money they made from government subsidies. This meant shortcuts everywhere, inadequate safety measures, rushed blasting jobs, and workers pushed to exhaustion. Tired men make deadly mistakes, especially when handling explosives. Railroad workers also faced attacks from Native American tribes, who rightfully saw these iron roads as threats to their way of life. Construction crews had to work with rifles nearby, ready to drop their tools and fight. Some work sites looked more like military camps than construction zones, with guards posted around the clock. Medical care was practically non-existent on remote construction sites. A serious injury usually meant death because the nearest doctor could be hundreds of miles away. Workers treated each other's wounds with whatever they had on hand: whiskey for antiseptic, cloth torn from shirts for bandages. Infection killed as many workers as accidents did. Equipment failures added another layer of danger. Steam-powered machinery was new technology, and boiler explosions were common. These weren't small pops. They were devastating blasts that could level entire work areas. Poorly maintained equipment meant workers never knew when their tools might literally blow up in their faces. Despite all this, railroads got built. Men kept signing up for these deadly jobs because the pay was better than anything else available to immigrants and laborers. The promise of steady wages was worth risking everything, even when everything included a very real chance of being blown to pieces or buried alive. While railroad builders faced death from explosives and cave-ins above ground, other frontier workers were digging even deeper into danger, chasing fortunes that glittered in the darkness below. Railroad workers might have faced dynamite daily, but gold miners, they descended into literal death traps every morning before sunrise. These weren't your modern mining operations with safety protocols and emergency exits. We're talking about narrow holes carved into mountainsides where one wrong move could bury you alive. Most miners worked by candlelight or oil lamps that barely cut through the darkness. The flickering flames created dancing shadows that made it nearly impossible to spot loose rocks or structural weaknesses. Or worse yet, those same flames could ignite pockets of methane gas that accumulated in poorly ventilated shafts. One spark in the wrong place meant instant death for everyone underground. Cave-ins happened so frequently that miners developed a grim sense of humor about it. They'd joke about kissing the ceiling goodbye each morning, knowing full well that tons of rock could collapse without warning. The support beams were often hastily installed green timber that hadn't properly dried. As the wood settled and warped, entire sections of tunnel would groan ominously before giving way. Then there's the issue of oxygen. Deep underground, breathable air became precious as gold itself. Miners frequently passed out from lack of oxygen, or were overcome by poisonous gases that seeped from rock formations. Carbon monoxide, hydrogen sulfide, and other deadly vapors lurked invisibly in the tunnels. Many miners simply collapsed and never woke up. Water presented another constant nightmare. Underground springs could flood a mine in minutes, trapping workers with no escape route. The lucky ones drowned quickly. Others found themselves caught in rising water for hours or days, slowly succumbing to hypothermia in the freezing underground pools. Some mines had primitive hand pumps, but they were often inadequate against sudden flooding. The tools themselves were dangerous enough to maim or kill. Heavy pickaxes swung in cramped spaces regularly struck other miners. Blasting powder was handled by men with zero training in explosives. They'd pack black powder into cracks, light a fuse, and hope they had enough time to scramble to safety. Miscalculations meant getting buried under rubble or torn apart by premature explosions. What makes this even more tragic? Most miners never struck it rich. The average prospector spent months or years underground, slowly destroying his lungs with rock dust and toxic fumes, only to find worthless ore. The few who did discover gold often had their claims jumped by armed gangs or lost everything to con artists in town. Supply lines to remote mining camps were unreliable at best. Miners frequently went without proper food, clean water or medical supplies for weeks. Scurvy, dysentery and other diseases ran rampant through mining communities. A simple cut could turn into a life-threatening infection, with no doctor within hundreds of miles. The psychological toll was just as brutal as the physical dangers. Months of working in complete darkness, surrounded by constant threats, drove many miners to madness. Suicide rates in mining camps were astronomical. Others turned to alcohol or opium to numb the fear, which only made the dangerous work more deadly. Professional mining operations weren't much safer than individual prospectors. Company mines pushed workers harder and deeper, often ignoring obvious safety hazards to maximize profits. When accidents happened, families received little or no compensation. Dead miners were simply replaced by the next wave of desperate fortune seekers. Some miners developed superstitions to cope with the constant danger. They'd refuse to work on certain days, carry lucky charms, or perform elaborate rituals before entering the tunnels. While these practices had no real protective value, they provided psychological comfort in an occupation where death lurked around every corner. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Men risked everything to extract gold that would make others wealthy, while they themselves lived in squalid conditions and faced daily mortality. Mining camp graveyards filled up faster than the miners' pockets ever did. Winter mining was particularly hellish. Miners would work in underground temperatures near freezing, then emerge to blizzard conditions that could kill them before they reached shelter. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes that made the already dangerous work even more difficult. Equipment failures added another layer of risk. Rope ladders rotted and snapped, sending miners plummeting down shafts. Pulley systems used to haul ore broke under strain, crushing anyone below. Even the wooden buckets used to carry rocks could become deadly projectiles when cables failed. Despite all these horrors, new miners kept arriving daily, driven by gold fever and desperation. The promise of instant wealth was too tempting to resist, even when mining camp cemeteries told the real story of what happened to most prospectors. But while miners faced death in the darkness below ground, another group of frontier workers risked their lives racing across the open plains above. Mail carriers and Pony Express riders had their own deadly challenges waiting on the trail. The Pony Express promised something crazy: mail delivery across 2,000 miles in just 10 days. That might sound slow today, but in 1860, it was lightning fast. Letters that once took months to reach California would arrive in a week and a half. The catch? Someone had to ride like hell through some of the most dangerous territory in America. These weren't your typical mail carriers walking house to house. Pony Express riders were mostly teenagers and young men in their early 20s, chosen because they were light, fearless, and apparently had very little sense of self-preservation. The job ad famously read, "Wanted young, skinny, wiry fellows not over 18. Must be expert riders, willing to risk death daily, orphans preferred." That last part wasn't a joke. The company genuinely preferred riders without families who might sue if things went badly. Each rider covered about 75 to 100 miles before passing the mail to the next guy. But here's where it gets wild. They rode alone through territories crawling with outlaws, hostile tribes, and wild animals. No backup, no radio for help, just a fast horse, a gun, and whatever courage they could muster. The mail pouches were locked leather cases called mochilas that fit over the saddle. Riders had to protect these with their lives, literally. Company rules stated that if attacked, a rider should fight to save the mail first, the horse second, and himself third. Talk about priorities. Some riders carried the mail on foot for miles after their horses were shot out from under them. Weather didn't care about delivery schedules either. Riders pushed through blizzards so thick they couldn't see their horses' ears. Summer heat waves turned the desert into a furnace that could kill a man in hours. Flash floods turned peaceful streams into raging death traps. One rider named Howard Egan once rode through a snowstorm so severe that he had to feel his way along fence posts to stay on the trail. Then there were the human threats. Bandits loved targeting Pony Express riders because they knew valuable mail meant wealthy targets might pay good money for delivery. Some outlaws made a specialty of ambushing riders at river crossings or mountain passes where escape was nearly impossible. The smart ones learned to vary their routes, but the terrain often left only one viable path, exactly where the bad guys waited. Native American tribes posed another constant danger, though not always for the reasons you might think. Many attacks happened because other white settlers had broken treaties or stolen land, and the mail riders just happened to be the next white faces the angry warriors encountered. The riders weren't soldiers or land grabbers, but try explaining that while galloping for your life. Buffalo Bill Cody, who later became famous for his Wild West shows, started as a Pony Express rider at age 14. He once rode 322 miles in 21 hours and 40 minutes when the rider at the next station had been killed. That's like riding from New York to Boston without stopping, except through hostile territory on a horse instead of a highway. The horses themselves were carefully selected for speed and endurance, but they weren't superhuman. Riders changed mounts at relay stations spaced about 10 to 15 miles apart, assuming the stations hadn't been burned down or the fresh horses stolen. Sometimes riders arrived to find nothing but ashes and had to push their exhausted horses even further. What made the job even more brutal was the time pressure. The whole system depended on maintaining that 10-day schedule. Riders couldn't take shelter during storms or wait out dangerous situations. The mail had to keep moving, which meant riders often made decisions that were brave, stupid, or both. Most riders lasted only a few months before quitting, getting injured, or worse. The turnover rate was insane. Some lasted just weeks before deciding that risking their lives for $100 a month wasn't worth it. Others stuck it out but carried scars and stories that would last a lifetime. The Pony Express only operated for 18 months before the transcontinental telegraph made it obsolete. But in that short time, these young riders became legends. They proved that with enough guts and fast horses, you could connect a continent even when civilization was still rough around the edges. The riders' courage opened the door for safer, more reliable mail service that would follow. But first, someone had to figure out how to move massive herds of cattle across those same dangerous territories, a job that would test different kinds of bravery and create its own deadly challenges. Cowboys driving cattle across hundreds of miles faced dangers that would make most people quit before breakfast. These weren't the romanticized heroes you see in movies. They were mostly young men, some barely teenagers, tasked with moving thousands of unpredictable animals through territory that wanted them dead. The typical cattle drive stretched between 600 to 1,000 miles. That's like walking from New York to Florida, except with 2,000 angry cattle and no roadside motels. Most drives took 3 to 4 months, moving roughly 15 miles per day when everything went perfectly, which it rarely did. River crossings killed more cattle and cowboys than any other single hazard. Rivers didn't come with convenient bridges or shallow spots marked with helpful signs. Cowboys had to scout ahead, find the least deadly crossing point, then somehow convince terrified cattle to plunge into rushing water. Cattle can't swim well. They thrash around like giant panicked bathtubs with legs. Many drowned. Others got swept downstream, taking their riders with them. Then there were the storms. Prairie thunderstorms make modern weather look like a gentle mist. Lightning strikes could kill entire groups of cattle instantly, and the thunder sent herds into wild stampedes. Cowboys learned to sleep with one ear open because storms meant all hands on deck regardless of the hour, but stampedes, those were pure nightmare fuel. A herd of 2,000 cattle moving at full speed creates a sound like an earthquake mixed with a freight train. The ground literally shakes under your feet. Cowboys had to ride alongside these thundering masses of beef, trying to turn the lead animals in a wide circle until the herd exhausted itself. Fall off your horse during a stampede, and you'd be trampled into the dirt faster than you could scream for help. Night shifts made everything worse. Cowboys worked in rotating watches, typically 4-hour shifts throughout the night. Cattle don't sleep soundly, they're prey animals, always nervous, always ready to bolt. A sudden noise, a coyote's howl, even a cowboy coughing too loudly could trigger a stampede in pitch darkness. Imagine trying to control 2,000 panicked animals when you can't see your own hand in front of your face. Snake bites presented constant danger, especially during night watches. Rattlesnakes loved the warmth of sleeping cattle and cowboys. Many cowboys woke up to find snakes coiled in their bedrolls or boots. Smart cowboys always shook out their boots before putting them on, but exhausted men sometimes forgot. A rattlesnake bite miles from the nearest doctor usually meant a slow, agonizing death. The weather tried to kill cowboys in creative ways. Summer heat on the open plains regularly hit 110 degrees with no shade for miles. Cowboys wore heavy clothing to protect against sun and thorns, which made the heat even more brutal. Dehydration killed men regularly. Winter drives were equally deadly. Blizzards could freeze cowboys to their saddles, and frostbite claimed fingers, toes, and sometimes entire limbs. Food poisoning was another silent killer. Cowboys ate mostly beans, hardtack, and whatever meat they could get. The camp cook, usually called cookie, prepared meals in less than sanitary conditions using questionable ingredients. Bad water, spoiled meat, or contaminated beans could lay out half the crew with dysentery, which was often fatal on the trail. Let's not forget the human threats. Cattle rustlers sometimes attacked drives, especially near the end when herds were worth the most money. These weren't polite robberies. Rustlers killed cowboys and stole entire herds. Some gangs specialized in hitting drives just before they reached market towns, stealing months of work and risking dozens of lives for quick profit. The isolation messed with men's minds too. Months on the trail with the same small crew, eating the same terrible food, facing constant danger. It drove some cowboys crazy. Arguments over trivial things sometimes erupted into deadly gunfights. More than one drive ended with cowboys shooting each other over card games or perceived slights. Despite all these dangers, the pay was terrible. Most cowboys earned about $30 per month, roughly the same as a store clerk in town who slept in a real bed every night. The trail boss might earn $100 per month, but he also carried the responsibility of keeping everyone alive and the herd intact. Yet thousands of young men signed up for cattle drives every year. Some craved adventure. Others had no better options. Many were running from something, the law, debts, or disappointed families back home. The irony is thick as morning coffee. Cowboys became American legends, symbols of freedom and rugged independence. But the real cowboys lived harsh, dangerous lives that most people today wouldn't endure for a week. They faced death daily for wages that barely covered their gear. While cowboys battled stampedes and river crossings, other frontier workers faced equally deadly challenges in completely different environments. Some hunters made their living pursuing creatures that could kill them with a single bite. Most folks today jump at the sight of a garden snake. Back in the Wild West, some men made their living catching creatures that could kill you with a single bite. Rattlesnake hunters risked everything for a few dollars and the odd thrill of wrestling death itself. These weren't your typical outdoorsmen looking for adventure on weekends. Rattlesnake hunting was serious business, driven by surprising demand from saloons, traveling shows, and curious folks who wanted rattles as souvenirs. Snake oil salesmen needed the real deal for their dubious miracle cures. Makes sense, right? Well, someone had to catch those snakes first. The job required nerves of steel and lightning-fast reflexes. Hunters carried long wooden sticks with forked ends, heavy leather gloves that went up to their elbows, and thick boots that could stop fangs from reaching skin. But gear only helped so much when you're dealing with creatures designed by nature to kill efficiently. Professional hunters developed their own techniques over time. Some preferred the grab-and-bag method, pinning the snake's head with their stick before snatching it behind the skull. Others used wire cages with funnel entrances, baiting them with dead mice or birds. The really bold ones, they'd grab rattlers barehanded, relying purely on speed and experience to avoid the business end. But here's the terrifying part: antivenom didn't exist yet. Getting bitten meant relying on folk remedies that ranged from useless to downright dangerous. Whiskey was the go-to treatment, along with cutting open the bite and sucking out venom. Some hunters carried small bottles of ammonia, believing it neutralized poison. Others swore by chewing tobacco packed into the wound. Most of these cures probably killed more people than they saved. The mortality rate among rattlesnake hunters was staggering. One bite could mean death within hours, depending on the snake's size and how much venom it injected. Experienced hunters learned to read snake behavior, knowing when a rattler was about to strike versus when it was just warning them off. They could identify different species by sound alone, since each type of rattlesnake produced slightly different rattle patterns. Then there were the showmen, who took things to another level entirely. These performers wrestled snakes in front of crowds, handling multiple rattlers simultaneously while spectators gasped and cheered. They'd drape snakes around their necks, kiss them on the head, and perform death-defying stunts that would make modern safety inspectors faint. The pay was better than regular hunting, but the risks multiplied exponentially. Wild West saloons created steady demand for rattlesnake parts. Bartenders hung dried skins on walls as decoration, while the rattles became popular trinkets for gamblers who believed they brought luck. Some establishments even served rattlesnake meat, claiming it tasted like chicken and possessed magical healing properties. Every piece of a snake could be sold, creating economic incentive for this deadly profession. The worst part wasn't just the snakes themselves, though. Rattlers love hiding in exactly the places humans need to go. They'd coil up inside boots left overnight, nest under bedrolls, and lurk in woodpiles where hunters needed to gather fuel for campfires. Many hunters got bitten not while actually hunting, but during routine camp activities when they let their guard down for just a moment. Successful hunters developed almost supernatural awareness of their surroundings. They learned to spot the subtle signs of snake presence: disturbed sand patterns, shed skins, or the faint musky smell that rattlers give off. The best ones could work in complete darkness, identifying snakes by the heat they radiated, or the barely audible sound of scales sliding across rock. Weather made everything worse. Hot summer days drove snakes to seek shade in the same spots humans wanted to rest. Spring brought newly awakened rattlers, cranky and aggressive after months of hibernation. Even winter wasn't safe, since snakes sometimes gathered in large groups in caves or rock crevices, creating concentrated danger zones. Despite the risks, some hunters thrived in this deadly profession for decades. They passed down techniques through apprenticeships, teaching newcomers which snakes to avoid entirely and which ones were worth the risk. The legendary hunters earned reputations that spread across territories, with saloon owners and showmen specifically requesting their services. But perhaps the strangest aspect was how normal it seemed at the time. In an era where death lurked around every corner, wrestling venomous snakes for money didn't appear much crazier than any other frontier job. These men simply found their niche in the Wild West's brutal economy of risk and reward. While rattlesnake hunters faced nature's deadliest creatures for profit, other men in the frontier made their living tracking an even more dangerous prey. The bounty hunters who pursued wanted criminals across vast territories knew that their targets could think, plan, and shoot back with deadly accuracy. In the Wild West, if you had a price on your head, there was someone out there hunting you for money. Bounty hunters made their living tracking down wanted criminals and bringing them in, dead or alive. The phrase "dead or alive" wasn't just movie drama, it was printed right on the wanted posters. These weren't lawmen with badges and steady salaries. Bounty hunters worked for themselves, chasing rewards that could range from $50 for a horse thief to thousands for notorious gang leaders. The bigger the bounty, the more dangerous the target. Makes sense, right? Nobody puts a $1,000 price tag on someone who steals apples. What made bounty hunting so deadly was the simple math of survival. You're tracking armed criminals who know you're coming and have nothing to lose. They've already broken the law enough times to get a bounty on their heads. Shooting one more person, especially someone hunting them, barely registers as a moral dilemma. Most bounty hunters worked alone because splitting rewards meant less money, and finding trustworthy partners in this line of work was nearly impossible. Working solo meant no backup when things went sideways, and things went sideways a lot. Outlaws didn't surrender politely when cornered. They fought like trapped animals because that's essentially what they were. The famous bounty hunter John X. Bidler tracked criminals across Montana Territory in the 1860s. He once spent 3 weeks following a gang through freezing mountain passes, living on jerky and melted snow. When he finally caught up to them, they'd set an ambush. Bidler survived because he'd learned to approach camps from unexpected angles, like crawling through a half-frozen creek at dawn instead of riding in on horseback. Then there's the problem of identification. Wanted posters featured crude drawings, not photographs. Bounty hunters sometimes grabbed the wrong person, leading to awkward conversations and occasionally gunfights with innocent folks who didn't appreciate being mistaken for murderers. The really paranoid bounty hunters carried multiple wanted posters and spent considerable time studying facial features before making their move. Payment wasn't guaranteed even after capturing your target. Some sheriffs demanded extensive proof that you'd caught the right criminal, others questioned whether the bounty hunter had used legal methods. A few corrupt officials simply refused to pay, betting that a lone bounty hunter wouldn't challenge the local law in court. What's a bounty hunter going to do? File a complaint. The psychological toll was brutal. Constantly looking over your shoulder changes a person. Many bounty hunters became suspicious of everyone, sleeping with guns under their pillows and checking every shadow for threats. They'd made enemies of entire outlaw networks. Brothers, cousins, and gang members of captured criminals often sought revenge. Some bounty hunters developed reputations that preceded them into towns. Pat Garrett became famous after killing Billy the Kid, but that fame made him a target. Other outlaws wanted to be the one who took down the man who killed Billy. Fame in the bounty hunting business was a double-edged sword. It might intimidate some criminals, but it painted a permanent target on your back. The strangest part of this profession was how it blurred moral lines. Bounty hunters often used methods that weren't exactly legal. They'd break into houses, threaten family members for information, or set elaborate traps. Since they weren't official lawmen, the rules governing police conduct didn't apply to them. This grey area made them effective, but also dangerous to innocent bystanders. Weather and terrain added extra challenges. Tracking someone across desert in summer heat or through mountain blizzards required survival skills beyond gunfighting. Many bounty hunters died not from bullets but from exposure, dehydration, or falls from cliffs while pursuing their quarry through treacherous landscape. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that bounty hunters and outlaws often had similar backgrounds. Former criminals sometimes became bounty hunters because they understood how fugitives thought. They knew the hideouts, the escape routes, and the underground networks. Who better to catch a thief than someone who used to be one? Equipment costs ate into profits significantly. Horses, weapons, ammunition, food, and camping gear weren't cheap. A bounty hunter might spend months tracking a target, burning through money on supplies, only to discover the criminal had already been caught by someone else or killed in an unrelated shootout. But here's the weird part. Some bounty hunters became folk heroes despite their morally questionable profession. People respected their courage and independence. In towns plagued by crime, a successful bounty hunter was often welcomed like a celebrity. They'd cleaned up problems that local law enforcement couldn't handle. The average career lasted about as long as you'd expect for someone who made a living cornering desperate criminals. Most bounty hunters either died violently, got seriously injured and retired, or eventually took safer jobs. The smart ones saved their money and bought legitimate businesses. The unlucky ones ended up with bounties on their own heads. While bounty hunters tracked dangerous men across vast territories, another group faced different but equally deadly challenges, navigating treacherous waters that could kill just as quickly as any outlaw's gun. Riverboat pilots in the Wild West lived with death lurking around every bend. These skilled navigators steered massive paddle wheelers down treacherous waterways where one wrong move meant disaster. The Missouri, Mississippi, and Colorado rivers weren't friendly highways. They were liquid death traps disguised as transportation routes. Hidden sandbars shifted overnight, creating invisible walls that could rip a boat's hull apart. Floating logs, some as big as telephone poles, waited just beneath the murky surface like wooden torpedoes. Pilots squinted through morning fog and pitch-black nights, trying to read water that changed faster than a poker player's luck. One miscalculation sent passengers, cargo, and crew straight to the bottom. Then there were the boiler explosions. These steam-powered giants ran on massive boilers that heated water to dangerous pressures. When those boilers blew, and they blew often, the explosion could be heard for miles. Scalding steam shot through passenger decks like invisible bullets. Metal fragments turned into deadly shrapnel that sliced through anything in their path. Some explosions were so violent they launched entire sections of boats hundreds of feet into the air. Pilots worked insane hours with zero safety equipment. No life jackets, no radio communication, no weather reports. They relied on experience, instinct and pure luck. A typical shift lasted 12 to 16 hours, navigating waters that could kill them in a dozen different ways. Exhaustion made simple mistakes deadly, and there was no such thing as a sick day when passengers depended on you. Pirates added another layer of terror to river travel. These weren't the romantic seafaring pirates from storybooks. They were ruthless criminals who knew riverboats carried valuable cargo and wealthy passengers. They attacked slow-moving vessels trapped in narrow channels where escape was impossible. Pilots found themselves caught between armed bandits and treacherous waters, forced to choose between surrender and a fight they probably couldn't win. Weather turned rivers into liquid nightmares without warning. Spring floods transformed gentle streams into raging torrents that swept away entire boats. Ice storms created floating obstacles that could puncture hulls or jam paddle wheels. Lightning strikes started fires on wooden vessels loaded with flammable cargo. Sudden windstorms pushed boats into rocky shorelines or flipped them like toys. Navigation tools were primitive and often useless. Pilots memorized every twist, sandbar, and snag through pure experience. They developed an almost supernatural ability to read water, spotting dangerous currents by subtle changes in surface patterns. Veteran pilots could tell water depth by its color and predict hidden obstacles by how the current moved. This knowledge took years to develop, and many died learning it. River traffic made everything more dangerous. Multiple boats shared narrow channels, creating maritime traffic jams where collisions were common. Faster boats overtaking slower ones led to racing competitions that put everyone at risk. Pilots pushed their engines beyond safe limits, increasing the chance of boiler explosions. Pride killed more riverboat workers than common sense could save. Cargo created unique hazards depending on what boats carried. Gunpowder shipments turned vessels into floating bombs. Livestock could panic and stampede, throwing off a boat's balance. Heavy machinery shifted during rough water, sometimes punching holes through deck planking. Even seemingly harmless cargo like grain could become deadly if it got wet and expanded, bursting through hull walls. The pilot's wheelhouse offered little protection from violence or accidents. These elevated cabins gave pilots better visibility, but made them perfect targets for pirates or hostile tribes along shorelines. Windows provided no real barrier against bullets or flying debris from explosions. Many pilots died at their wheels, still trying to steer their boats to safety as disaster unfolded around them. Training new pilots was a deadly apprenticeship system. Experienced captains took on young men who learned by watching and doing, often during actual emergencies. Mistakes during training could kill everyone aboard, so the pressure was enormous. Many apprentices quit after witnessing their first major accident. Those who stayed developed nerves of steel and reflexes like cats. Some pilots became legends for their skill and bravery. They navigated impossible conditions, saved passengers from sinking boats, and fought off pirate attacks with nothing but determination and river knowledge. These heroes earned respect throughout frontier communities, but fame didn't make the job any safer. Riverboat pilots worked knowing each trip might be their last, yet they kept steering through waters that killed weaker men. Their courage kept commerce flowing and communities connected across vast wilderness areas. But while riverboat pilots faced death on the water, another group of frontier workers dealt with violence on dry land. Saloon owners didn't just serve drinks, they managed powder kegs of human emotion that exploded without warning. When most folks think about dangerous Wild West jobs, they picture cowboys dodging stampedes or sheriffs facing down outlaws in dusty streets. But here's something that might surprise you. Running a saloon was one of the deadliest businesses in frontier towns. These weren't just places where people grabbed a quick drink after work. Saloons were powder kegs waiting to explode, and the poor souls who owned them had targets painted on their backs every single night. The biggest threat: violence erupted faster than you could pour whiskey. Cowboys fresh off cattle drives came to town with months of pay burning holes in their pockets and frustrations boiling over. Mix alcohol, gambling, and exhausted men carrying loaded guns, and you've got a recipe for disaster that made every saloon keeper's life a daily gamble. Fights didn't start with polite disagreements either. Someone would accuse another player of cheating at cards, or a cowboy would get mad about watered-down whiskey, and suddenly chairs were flying and bullets were whistling past the bartender's head. But wait, it gets worse. Many saloon owners weren't just innocent businessmen trying to make an honest living. A surprising number were former gunslingers, outlaws, or men with violent pasts who figured running a drinking establishment was their ticket to respectability. Wrong move. Their reputations followed them like shadows, and every hothead looking to make a name for himself saw these ex-outlaws as walking targets. Nothing said, "I'm tough," like taking down a famous former gunfighter, even if he was just trying to serve drinks and stay out of trouble. Then there's the robbery problem that kept saloon keepers awake at night. These establishments handled more cash than most banks in small frontier towns. Miners flush with gold dust, cattlemen with roll after roll of bills, and gamblers with their winnings created tempting targets for desperate men. Robbers knew saloons stayed open late, when the town marshal might be asleep or busy elsewhere. Some owners got robbed so regularly they started keeping decoy cash registers while hiding the real money in secret spots that would make modern security experts jealous. Fire posed another constant threat that most people don't think about. Saloons used oil lamps and candles for lighting, had wooden floors soaked with spilled alcohol, and hosted customers who smoked pipes and cigars while drinking. One knocked over lamp during a brawl, and the whole place could go up in flames faster than you could say "last call." Many saloon keepers watched their life's work burn to ashes because some drunk cowboy got careless with a lit cigarette during a poker game. Legal troubles made things even more complicated. Gambling was illegal in many territories, but saloons that didn't offer card games couldn't compete. So owners found themselves walking a tightrope between staying in business and avoiding jail time. Corrupt lawmen sometimes demanded bribes to look the other way, while honest sheriffs might shut down operations without warning. Smart saloon keepers learned to read the political winds and figure out which palms needed greasing to keep their doors open. The customer base itself was like handling dynamite with wet fuses. You had cattle drivers who hadn't seen civilization in months, miners who'd been isolated in the wilderness, soldiers from nearby forts, and drifters running from the law or looking for trouble. Each group had different ideas about how to have fun, and those ideas often involved proving their toughness to everyone else in the room. Saloon owners became expert diplomats, learning to defuse situations before they exploded while still keeping the atmosphere lively enough to bring customers back. Female employees added another layer of complexity and danger. Many saloons employed women as servers, entertainers, or companions, and protecting them from overly aggressive customers became the owner's responsibility. Some proprietors hired armed guards or bouncers, but that meant more wages to pay and more guns in an already volatile situation. Other owners took matters into their own hands, keeping shotguns behind the bar and learning to use them with deadly accuracy. Location mattered too, but not in the way you might expect. Saloons near railroad stations saw transient troublemakers passing through constantly. Those near mining camps dealt with men who'd been drinking their own homemade rot gut for months before hitting town. Establishments close to cattle trails faced waves of cowboys celebrating the end of long, dangerous drives. Every location came with its own unique brand of chaos that owners had to navigate while trying to turn a profit. The strangest part? Many saloon keepers genuinely loved their dangerous work. They thrived on the excitement, the colorful characters, and the feeling that they were providing an essential service in harsh frontier communities. These men and women became the unofficial social centers of their towns, places where news traveled, deals got made, and legends were born. Of course, saloon owners weren't the only ones facing nightly danger in these establishments. The people actually serving the drinks and dealing with drunk customers up close had their own unique set of deadly challenges that made tending bar an art form requiring nerves of steel. Working behind a Wild West bar wasn't just about pouring whiskey and wiping down glasses. When drunk cowboys started throwing punches and outlaws used saloons as hideouts, bartenders and barmaids faced life-threatening situations every single shift. The moment trouble walked through those swinging doors, everyone behind the bar knew their night was about to get dangerous. Fights erupted without warning over card games, unpaid debts, or someone looking at another man's woman the wrong way. Glass bottles became weapons, chairs turned into clubs, and the poor souls serving drinks found themselves ducking behind the bar while bullets flew overhead. Late night hours made everything worse. Most violence happened after midnight, when men had been drinking for hours and their judgment disappeared completely. Barmaids working the overnight shift faced the highest risks. Drunk customers got handsy, aggressive, or downright violent when they didn't get what they wanted. Many barmaids learned to carry small derringers hidden in their skirts or keep a knife tucked in their boot. Then there were the pickpockets and thieves who treated saloons like their personal shopping centers. They'd slip through crowds during busy nights, lifting wallets and jewelry from distracted customers. Smart barkeeps kept a shotgun under the bar and weren't afraid to use it. When someone tried robbing the till or threatening the staff, things got ugly fast. The weird part is how many barmaids doubled as information gatherers. Some worked secretly for lawmen, keeping their ears open for talk about planned robberies or wanted criminals hiding in town. Others sold information to the highest bidder. This spy work paid well but came with deadly consequences if the wrong people discovered their real job. Physical dangers weren't limited to fights and robberies either. Saloons used cheap kerosene lamps for lighting, and fires started regularly when drunk patrons knocked them over. Barkeeps had to move fast to put out flames before the whole wooden building went up in smoke. Many saloons burned to the ground, taking nearby buildings with them. Working conditions were brutal by any standard. Most saloons stayed open from noon until well past midnight, 7 days a week. Staff worked 12-hour shifts on their feet, breathing smoke-filled air and dealing with the worst society had to offer. No sick days existed. Miss work and someone else took your job. Let's not forget the health hazards nobody talks about. Spittoons overflowed with tobacco juice and worse things. Vomit covered floors regularly. Blood from fights stained everything. Disease spread quickly in these crowded, unsanitary spaces. Many bar workers died young from tuberculosis, pneumonia, or other illnesses that thrived in dirty environments. Some of the toughest people in the Old West worked behind bars. Take Mary Big Nose Kate Horney, who worked saloons throughout the frontier. She carried multiple weapons, knew how to use them, and had a reputation for being meaner than most of the outlaws who frequented her establishments. Stories say she once shot a man who tried to assault another barmaid. The money could be decent if you survived long enough to collect it. Experienced barmaids in successful saloons earned more than school teachers or seamstresses. Tips from winning gamblers sometimes included gold nuggets or valuable jewelry, but the job had an extremely high turnover rate for obvious reasons. Smart saloon workers developed survival skills that would impress modern bodyguards. They learned to read people quickly, spotting troublemakers before fights started. Many could disarm drunk men without escalating situations. Others mastered the art of diffusing tensions with humor or strategic free drinks. Violence wasn't always random either. Some barmaids had vengeful ex-lovers track them down. Others made enemies of dangerous men who didn't appreciate being turned down or thrown out. Feuds between different outlaw gangs sometimes played out in saloons with staff caught in the crossfire. The isolation made everything harder. Most frontier towns had limited law enforcement, and sheriffs couldn't be everywhere at once. When trouble erupted in a saloon, the people working there were on their own. Help might arrive eventually, but survival depended on quick thinking and quicker reflexes. Female saloon workers faced additional challenges that male bartenders didn't. Society already looked down on women who worked in drinking establishments, considering them immoral regardless of their actual behavior. This stigma made it harder to find other work or integrate into respectable community life. But here's what made these workers truly remarkable. They kept going despite everything. Night after night, they showed up knowing danger waited behind every customer interaction. They developed thick skin, sharp instincts, and an ability to handle crisis situations that would terrify most people today. The skills learned behind Wild West bars created some of the frontier's most resourceful survivors. These weren't just drink slingers serving alcohol, they were crisis managers, conflict negotiators, and street-smart operators who could handle anything the lawless frontier threw at them. While saloon workers dealt with immediate dangers inside their establishments, another group faced an even grimmer reality on the frontier: those who made their living from the constant presence of death itself. When barmaids finished cleaning up broken glass from the latest saloon brawl, they knew someone would be calling the town's busiest professional. Death was everywhere in the Wild West, and that meant undertakers never ran out of work. These grim specialists dealt with humanity's darkest moments while everyone else looked away. The sheer volume of bodies made undertaking a constant juggling act. Gunfights, disease, accidents, and natural disasters filled makeshift morgues faster than coffins could be built. A single typhoid outbreak might bring 20 customers in 1 week. Then there's the violence factor. Some towns averaged 3 shooting deaths every weekend. Most undertakers kept a stack of pine boards ready, because custom work took too long when bullets were flying regularly. But here's where things got really dangerous for these death merchants. Handling unwashed, diseased corpses without proper protection meant undertakers faced constant infection risks. No rubber gloves existed, just bare hands touching bodies that had died from cholera, smallpox, or tuberculosis. Many undertakers caught fatal diseases from their customers and became their own final clients. Working hours made the job even riskier. Most burials happened at dawn or dusk to avoid the scorching heat, which meant digging graves in dim light. Undertakers often worked alone in cemeteries, making them perfect targets for grave robbers or desperate outlaws looking for easy cash. Some carried guns while preparing bodies, keeping weapons within arm's reach of their embalming tools. The technical side of frontier undertaking would make modern morticians cringe. Embalming fluid was often homemade concoctions of alcohol, salt, and whatever chemicals could be scrounged up. These mixtures sometimes exploded or released toxic fumes that knocked workers unconscious. One undertaker in Dodge City reportedly passed out 3 times in a single day from breathing his own preservation chemicals. Grave digging presented its own set of deadly challenges. Rocky soil required dynamite, which meant handling explosives while exhausted from working 16-hour days. Flash floods could fill half-finished graves overnight, forcing undertakers to start over in muddy conditions that bred disease. Winter ground froze so hard that graves had to be carved with pickaxes, a back-breaking process that injured many diggers. Then there's the social isolation that came with touching the dead all day. Most townspeople avoided undertakers like they carried the plague themselves. This meant working in complete solitude, which drove some funeral directors to drink heavily or develop serious mental health problems. Several documented cases show undertakers who started talking to their deceased clients as if they were still alive. The business side created unexpected dangers too. Families often couldn't pay for proper burials, leaving undertakers to absorb the costs or face angry relatives demanding free services. Some desperate families threatened violence when presented with bills they couldn't afford. Others accused undertakers of stealing jewelry from bodies, leading to confrontations that sometimes ended in gunfights right inside funeral parlors. Many frontier undertakers wore multiple professional hats out of necessity. They doubled as coroners, determining causes of death without medical training. Some also worked as doctors, switching between trying to save lives and preparing the bodies of patients they'd failed to heal. This constant exposure to death and failure created psychological stress that few could handle long-term. The really weird part, undertakers often knew more town secrets than anyone else. Examining bodies revealed evidence of murders disguised as accidents, affairs gone wrong, and family disputes turned deadly. This knowledge made them valuable sources of information, but also painted targets on their backs when powerful people wanted certain facts buried along with the bodies. Supply shortages added another layer of danger to daily operations. When coffin wood ran low, undertakers had to venture into dangerous territory to find lumber, sometimes traveling through areas controlled by hostile tribes or outlaw gangs. Getting caught alone while hauling wagon loads of wooden planks made them obvious robbery targets. Some undertakers developed reputation-based protection systems. The best funeral directors became so essential to their communities that even hardened criminals left them alone. Everyone knew they'd eventually need undertaking services for friends, family, or themselves. Killing the town's only competent undertaker was like shooting yourself in the foot. The physical demands destroyed many undertakers' health before middle age. Lifting dead weight repeatedly wrecked backs and shoulders. Constant exposure to chemicals burned lungs and skin. Poor lighting strained eyes beyond repair. Most frontier undertakers looked 20 years older than their actual age and died young from occupational hazards. Weather created additional complications that modern funeral directors never face. Desert heat accelerated decomposition so rapidly that bodies had to be buried within hours or become unmanageable health hazards. Mountain snow sometimes prevented burials for weeks, forcing undertakers to store multiple corpses in freezing buildings until spring thaw allowed proper interment. Despite all these dangers, frontier undertakers provided essential dignity for communities facing constant death. They gave closure to grieving families and helped maintain civilization's thin veneer in places where violence ruled daily life. While others focused on striking it rich or staying alive, undertakers quietly managed society's most fundamental transition. Speaking of people who worked with dangerous materials daily, other frontier workers also handled explosive substances that could kill instantly if mishandled. Deep beneath the surface of the Wild West, where sunlight never reached and fresh air was just a memory, tunnel diggers carved their way through solid rock with nothing but black powder explosives and raw determination. These underground warriors faced death every single day, and most people above ground had no idea just how deadly their work really was. Black powder wasn't like the stable explosives we know today. This stuff was unpredictable, temperamental, and had a nasty habit of going off when you least expected it. Tunnel diggers mixed their own batches, often by candlelight in cramped underground spaces. One spark in the wrong place. The entire tunnel could become a tomb in seconds. Workers learned to move like they were handling angry rattlesnakes, because in many ways they were. The explosion process itself was pure chaos. Diggers would drill holes into rock faces, pack them with black powder, light fuses, and run like hell. But here's the terrifying part. Fuses didn't always burn at the same speed. Sometimes they'd burn too fast, giving workers barely enough time to escape. Other times they'd seem to die out completely, only to suddenly roar back to life just as someone crept back to check on them. Then there were the cave-ins. Every blast weakened the tunnel structure, and gravity was always waiting for its chance. Rocks didn't fall gently, they came down like avalanches, crushing everything in their path. Workers who got caught had two choices: hope their buddies could dig them out fast, or prepare to meet their maker. Some men survived being buried for hours, clawing at loose dirt and praying for rescue. Others weren't so lucky, but the explosions and cave-ins were just the beginning of their problems. Underground air was poison soup. Dust from blasting coated workers' lungs like cement, slowly suffocating them from the inside. Many tunnel diggers developed what they called rock lung, a condition that left them coughing up blood and struggling for every breath. The irony was brutal. Men who spent their lives creating passages for others gradually lost their own ability to breathe. Toxic gases lurked in every corner of these underground death traps. Carbon monoxide from explosions could knock a man unconscious before he even knew what hit him. Methane gas would build up in pockets, waiting for one tiny spark to turn the entire tunnel into a furnace. Workers carried candles not just for light, but as primitive gas detectors. If the flame started acting weird, smart diggers got out fast. The tools these men used were medieval by today's standards: heavy hammers that could crush fingers in a heartbeat, steel drills that snapped without warning, sending metal shards flying like bullets. Everything had to be hauled in and out by hand through narrow passages barely wide enough for a grown man. Workers developed backs like pack mules and hands like leather gloves, but their bodies still broke down under the constant punishment. Water was another killer hiding in the shadows. Underground streams could flood tunnels in minutes, turning workplaces into death traps. Some diggers drowned in spaces they'd been working in just hours before. Others got swept away by sudden torrents, their bodies found miles downstream days later. Flash flooding was so common that experienced tunnel workers always knew where the nearest exit was, even in total darkness. Fire underground was absolutely terrifying. Wooden support beams, oil lamps, and explosive dust created the perfect recipe for disaster. When fires started, they spread faster than men could run, consuming oxygen and filling tunnels with deadly smoke. Some workers survived by diving into water-filled holes, holding their breath while flames roared overhead. Others weren't fast enough. The psychological toll was just as brutal as the physical dangers. Working in complete darkness for 12-hour shifts, never seeing sunlight, breathing poisonous air, it drove some men crazy. Tunnel diggers developed a dark sense of humor about death, joking about cave-ins and explosions because the alternative was going insane with fear. They knew the statistics: most wouldn't last more than a few years before injury, illness, or death forced them out. What made men choose this nightmare job? Money, plain and simple. Tunnel diggers earned more than most frontier workers because the work was so dangerous. Railroads and mining companies paid premium wages to anyone brave enough to go underground with black powder. For desperate men with families to feed, it was worth the risk. The weird part is how these underground warriors were forgotten by history. While cowboys and gunslingers became legends, tunnel diggers remained buried in obscurity, just like the passages they created. Their work literally built the foundation for America's expansion, yet few people even knew their names. While tunnel diggers battled death underground, another group of workers faced equally deadly challenges high above the earth, stringing the communication lines that would connect the expanding frontier. When most folks think about dangerous Wild West jobs, they picture gunfighters and gold miners, but here's what they miss. Some of the deadliest work happened way up in the air, stringing wires across America's most hostile territory. Telegraph and telephone linemen didn't just climb poles, they practically lived on them. These guys spent their days balancing hundreds of feet above ground, wrestling with heavy cables while prairie winds tried to knock them into next week. No safety harnesses existed back then. Your grip strength and balance were literally the difference between payday and becoming a pancake on the ground below. The height was just the beginning of their problems. Picture trying to work with your hands while a thunderstorm rolls across the plains. Smart linemen knew to get down fast when lightning started dancing around the horizon, but deadlines were deadlines, and bosses didn't care about weather. Many workers got caught up high when storms hit, getting struck by lightning while holding metal wire. Let's just say it wasn't a career-building experience. Then there's the shocking truth about electrical work in those days. Nobody really understood how electricity worked yet. Safety standards. What safety standards? Linemen regularly got zapped by live wires because proper shut-off procedures hadn't been invented. Some guys developed permanent shakes from repeated electrical shocks. Others weren't so lucky, they just dropped dead on the spot. But the real nightmare was working in hostile territory. Telegraph lines stretched across lands where different groups were still fighting bitter wars. Native tribes often saw these wire networks as symbols of unwanted change. Settlers viewed them as lifelines to civilization. This made linemen perfect targets for everyone's frustration. Repair crews faced a terrible choice when lines went down in dangerous areas. Go fix it immediately and risk attack, or wait for military escort that might never come. During this delay, entire towns could lose their only connection to the outside world. No communication meant no way to call for help during emergencies, no way to conduct business, no way to know if your family back east was alive or dead. Some linemen developed creative solutions for staying alive. They learned to work at dawn when most attacks were less likely. Others carried rifles alongside their tools, becoming half electrician, half soldier. A few smart ones made friends with local tribes by sharing food or teaching basic electrical concepts. These relationships sometimes meant the difference between completing a job and becoming target practice. Cross-country line installation was basically a military operation disguised as construction work. Teams moved in groups, always watching the horizon for trouble. They slept in shifts, keeping guards posted through the night. Equipment had to be portable enough to abandon quickly if things went sideways. Many crews lost everything: tools, supplies, sometimes their lives, and had to start over from scratch. Weather added another layer of misery to an already brutal job. Summer heat made metal tools too hot to handle without gloves, but gloves made the delicate wire work nearly impossible. Winter brought different problems. Frozen fingers couldn't grip properly, and metal became so cold it would stick to bare skin. Spring floods often washed out entire sections of line, forcing crews to rebuild from nothing. The financial pressure was enormous too. Telegraph companies promised fast communication across vast distances. When lines went down, they lost massive amounts of money every day. This pressure trickled down to linemen as impossible deadlines and corner cutting on safety. Crews were expected to work through dangerous conditions that should have shut down operations entirely. Equipment failures added their own special brand of terror. Wooden poles rotted without warning, suddenly collapsing under a lineman's weight. Wire connections failed during high winds, creating deadly whip-like cables that could slice a man in half. Primitive pulleys and climbing gear broke at the worst possible moments, usually when someone was too high up to survive the fall. Communication failures had consequences far beyond inconvenience. Military units depended on telegraph lines for coordinating operations. Business deals worth thousands of dollars hung on single messages getting through. Family emergencies, weather warnings, and crime reports all traveled these fragile wire networks. When linemen couldn't keep the system running, people died. Despite all these risks, linemen took pride in their work. They were literally connecting America, one dangerous wire at a time. Many developed incredible skills in reading weather, understanding local politics, and improvising solutions to technical problems. The job demanded intelligence, physical courage, and social awareness all rolled into one package. Some linemen made decent money when they survived long enough. Companies paid premium wages for workers willing to tackle the most dangerous installations, but most careers ended quickly. Injury, death, or simple burnout claimed the majority within a few years. These wire-stringing daredevils weren't the only ones risking everything to keep frontier towns running. While linemen connected communities from above, other essential workers faced their own deadly challenges right at ground level, dealing with something everyone needed, but nobody wanted to think about too carefully. While other frontier workers faced outlaws and wild animals, Butchers dealt with a different kind of danger every single day. These weren't your typical meat cutters standing behind clean glass cases. Frontier butchers wrestled half-wild cattle, dodged flying hooves, and wielded razor-sharp knives in conditions that would make modern health inspectors faint. The animals arriving at frontier butcher shops weren't calm, grain-fed livestock. Most came straight off cattle drives after weeks on the trail. They were ornery, scared, and ready to fight. Butchers had to be part wrestler, part animal whisperer. One wrong move near a terrified bull could end with broken ribs or worse. Many butchers carried the scars of close encounters with panicked animals who saw humans as threats, not helpers. Then there were the tools. Butchers worked with knives sharp enough to slice through bone, cleavers heavy enough to crush skulls, and meat hooks that could puncture vital organs. Accidents happened constantly. A slip of the hand while cutting could sever tendons or arteries. Blood made surfaces slippery, increasing the danger with every swing of the blade. Most frontier butchers were missing at least one fingertip by the end of their careers. But the real challenge wasn't just cutting meat. Frontier butchers often doubled as veterinarians, diagnosing sick animals and treating injuries. They had to spot diseased cattle before the meat hit the market. One mistake could poison an entire town. The pressure was enormous, especially when hungry cowboys demanded their steaks regardless of the animal's condition. Sanitation posed another deadly threat. Refrigeration didn't exist, so butchers worked fast to prevent spoilage. Flies swarmed everywhere. Blood pooled on wooden floors that rarely saw proper cleaning. Disease spread like wildfire in these conditions. Butchers frequently contracted infections from open cuts exposed to contaminated meat. Many developed what they called butcher's fever, probably various bacterial infections that modern medicine could easily cure. Customer relations added another layer of danger. Drunk cowboys didn't take kindly to being told the meat was sold out or too expensive. Arguments over prices regularly escalated to gunfights. Smart butchers kept loaded shotguns behind the counter, not for the animals but for the customers. Some of the most feared men in frontier towns were butchers who'd had enough of rowdy patrons. The work schedule was brutal. Animals had to be slaughtered at dawn before the heat spoiled the meat. Butchers worked through scorching afternoons and into the evening, racing against time and temperature. Sleep came in short bursts between cattle drives arriving in town. Exhaustion made every knife cut more dangerous, every animal encounter more unpredictable. Weather created additional hazards. During winter storms, butchers worked in barely heated shops, their hands numb from cold. Frozen meat was harder to cut, requiring more force and creating more opportunities for accidents. Summer brought different problems. The heat spoiled meat within hours, and butchers worked in stifling conditions surrounded by buzzing flies and the stench of blood. Some butchers specialized in wild game, which brought entirely different risks. Processing buffalo, elk, or bear required different techniques and presented unique dangers. Wild animal meat often carried parasites or diseases unknown to the butchers. They learned through trial and error, sometimes paying with their health or lives. The financial pressure was intense too. Butchers had to buy animals, process them quickly, and sell the meat before it spoiled. One bad batch could bankrupt a business. This led some butchers to take dangerous shortcuts, like processing questionable meat or working alone to save money on help. Yet butchers also served as informal doctors for both animals and people. They understood anatomy better than most frontier physicians. When the town doctor wasn't available, injured cowboys often turned to the local butcher for emergency surgery. These makeshift operations, performed with the same tools used for cutting meat, saved lives but also ended quite a few. The job attracted tough characters who could handle the blood, the danger, and the pressure. Many were former soldiers who'd seen enough violence to be unfazed by the brutal work. Others were immigrants willing to take any job that paid decent money. The turnover was high, between accidents, disease, and burnout. Most butchers didn't last more than a few years. Despite all these dangers, frontier butchers were essential to town survival. They provided the protein that kept communities alive. Their work was dirty, dangerous, and thankless, but absolutely necessary. While butchers battled blood and blades in sweltering shops, another group of workers faced a completely different kind of peril. They worked in conditions so cold that a single mistake could mean freezing to death in minutes. Ice cutting looked easy enough from the outside. Just chop some frozen blocks, haul them to town and collect your pay. Reality: these workers faced some of the deadliest conditions on the frontier, where a single mistake meant drowning in freezing water or losing fingers to frostbite. Winter mornings on frozen rivers started before dawn. Ice cutters arrived when temperatures dropped well below freezing, testing the thickness with long metal rods. They needed at least 8 inches of solid ice to support a man with tools. But here's the thing. Ice rarely froze evenly. Hidden currents underneath created weak spots that looked identical to solid sections. One wrong step and you'd crash through into water cold enough to kill you in minutes. The work itself was brutal. Teams used massive ice saws, some weighing over 50 pounds, to cut precise rectangles. These weren't small cubes for drinks. Commercial ice blocks measured 2 feet by 3 feet and weighed up to 300 pounds each. Workers spent hours bent over, soaring through thick ice while bitter winds cut through their clothes. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, and sometimes entire hands. Many cutters wrapped their tools in cloth just to grip them without their skin freezing to the metal. Then there's the constant danger of falling through cracked ice. Rivers shifted beneath the frozen surface, especially during temperature changes. What seemed solid at sunrise could develop hairline cracks by noon. Smart crews worked in pairs, keeping ropes nearby for rescue attempts. But when someone broke through, rescuers had maybe 5 minutes before hypothermia set in. The unlucky ones who fell through alone, their bodies often weren't found until spring thaw. Moving the ice blocks presented its own nightmares. Workers used metal tongs and thick chains to lift these massive chunks onto horse-drawn sleds. Dropped blocks could crush feet or legs instantly. The tongs sometimes slipped, sending 300-pound blocks sliding across the ice toward other workers. One crew member recalled watching a block slide into his partner's leg, shattering the bone so badly the man never walked right again. Loading wagons meant even more risk. Ice blocks were stacked 6 or 7 high, creating towering loads that shifted during transport. Drivers had to navigate bumpy frontier roads while keeping these unstable towers from toppling. When blocks fell, they fell hard and fast. Smart drivers learned to jump clear at the first sign of shifting cargo. The not-so-smart ones ended up crushed beneath hundreds of pounds of ice. Weather made everything worse. Blizzards could trap crews on frozen rivers for days. Some carried emergency supplies, but many didn't expect to work long enough for storms to matter. Rescue wasn't coming quickly. Most ice cutting happened miles from town on remote river sections. Crews built small fires on shore, but keeping warm while working in wet conditions proved nearly impossible. Equipment failures added another layer of danger. Ice saws broke under pressure, sending metal fragments flying. Ropes snapped while hauling blocks, whipping back to strike workers. The wooden planks used to slide ice blocks sometimes cracked, dropping workers knee-deep into partially frozen water. Wet feet in freezing temperatures meant frostbite within hours. But here's what made the job truly treacherous. The ice itself kept changing. Morning temperatures might create solid working conditions, but afternoon sun weakened the surface. Smart crews learned to read ice like sailors read weather. They listened for creaking sounds that meant stress fractures. They watched for color changes that indicated thin spots. The experienced cutters developed an almost supernatural sense for dangerous ice. Rivers sometimes shifted overnight, creating new hazards by morning. Spring-fed sections stayed softer longer. Areas with faster currents developed unstable ice that looked solid from above. Beaver dams changed water flow, creating unexpected weak spots. Even experienced crews couldn't predict every danger. The pay kept men coming back despite the risks. Towns needed ice year-round for food preservation, especially during hot summers. Saloons paid premium prices for clear, solid blocks. Medical practices required ice for treating injuries and fevers. A good crew could harvest enough ice in 3 winter months to support their families all year. Some workers lasted decades in the business. They developed techniques for testing ice thickness, reading weather patterns, and moving blocks safely. These veterans taught newcomers the subtle signs of dangerous conditions, but even experienced cutters faced constant risk. One moment of inattention, one patch of bad ice, one equipment failure could end everything. The men who cut ice weren't just fighting frozen rivers. They battled time itself, racing to harvest enough blocks before spring thaw made the work impossible. Every day brought fresh dangers, but the ice had to be cut and hauled while conditions allowed. Speaking of people who faced time pressure and unpredictable dangers, another group of frontier workers traveled constantly, facing suspicion and threats wherever they went. Snake oil, magic elixirs, and tonics that could cure everything from baldness to tuberculosis. Welcome to the world of traveling medicine shows, where performers risked their lives hawking questionable cures to desperate frontier folks. These wandering entertainers didn't just face the usual dangers of Wild West travel. They walked into hostile crowds who might discover their miracle remedies were nothing more than alcohol and sugar water. Most medicine show workers were part con artist, part entertainer, and completely expendable. They rolled into dusty towns with painted wagons, flashy costumes and bottles filled with mysterious liquids. The boss, usually calling himself Doctor something or other, would set up on the main street and start his pitch. But here's where things got dangerous fast. These weren't just sales presentations, they were high-stakes performances where one wrong move could get you shot. The performers themselves faced constant physical danger from their own products. Many shows featured live demonstrations where workers actually drank the tonics they were selling. Sounds harmless? Not when those bottles contained wood alcohol, laudanum, or other toxic ingredients mixed by people who had zero medical training. Some performers developed serious addictions to their own merchandise, while others suffered permanent damage from repeatedly consuming poisonous concoctions. Then there's the crowd factor. Frontier audiences weren't exactly known for their patience or forgiveness. When a customer discovered that the Indian hair grower didn't work, or worse, made their hair fall out completely, they didn't file complaints with customer service. They came looking for the medicine show with guns, ropes, and very bad intentions. Many performers learned to sleep with one eye open and keep fast horses ready. Medicine show workers also had to master the art of reading crowds instantly. Stay too long in one town, and angry customers would start comparing notes. Leave too quickly, and suspicious townsfolk might assume you were guilty of something. The timing had to be perfect. Sell enough bottles to make it profitable, but escape before anyone realized the miracle cancer cure was basically whiskey with food coloring. Violence wasn't their only concern. These traveling shows attracted all kinds of unsavory characters. Pickpockets worked the crowds during performances. Thieves followed the wagons, knowing medicine show operators carried cash from their sales. Some shows were robbed so frequently that the doctors started hiring armed guards, which made them look even more suspicious to local lawmen. The legal dangers were just as real as the physical ones. Many towns had laws against fraudulent medical claims, but enforcement was spotty and often corrupt. A medicine show might pay off one sheriff only to find themselves arrested by the next town's marshal. Some operators spent more time in frontier jails than on the road, and jail conditions in the 1800s weren't exactly comfortable. Weather posed another constant threat. Medicine shows traveled year-round, hauling heavy wagons across terrible roads in all conditions. Flash floods could wash away entire operations overnight. Winter storms left performers stranded for weeks with no income and dwindling supplies. Summer heat spoiled their already questionable products, and made outdoor performances nearly unbearable. But perhaps the most dangerous aspect was the desperate hope these shows exploited. Frontier families facing serious illnesses had few medical options. When a traveling doctor promised to cure consumption, cancer, or childhood diseases, parents would spend their last dollars on bottles of useless liquid. When those cures failed, and children died, grieving families sometimes took violent revenge. The performers themselves often came from desperate circumstances too. Many were failed actors, struggling musicians, or people fleeing legal troubles elsewhere. The medicine show circuit became a last resort for folks who couldn't make it anywhere else. They learned to juggle, play instruments, tell jokes, and deliver medical-sounding speeches, all while staying one step ahead of angry customers and suspicious lawmen. Some shows tried to add legitimacy by hiring actual doctors or using real medical equipment. This backfired spectacularly when the real doctors turned out to be equally fraudulent, or when expensive medical devices broke down in remote locations. One famous case involved a medicine show that claimed to use electrical therapy until their generator exploded during a demonstration, injuring several performers and audience members. The most successful medicine show workers developed thick skins and quick wit. They learned to handle hecklers with humor, dodge bottles thrown by angry customers, and sweet-talk their way out of trouble with local authorities. The job required equal parts showmanship, salesmanship, and survival instinct. Yet, despite all these dangers, medicine shows remained popular throughout the Wild West era. They brought entertainment to isolated communities, and even their fraudulent products sometimes provided placebo effects that made people feel better temporarily. The performers who survived developed skills that would later prove valuable in legitimate theater, early radio, and eventually Hollywood. These traveling entertainers faced dangers that most other frontier workers never encountered. The wrath of customers who discovered they'd been swindled. But as risky as medicine shows were, they weren't the only frontier profession where women worked in particularly dangerous circumstances. While most frontier jobs were dangerous, Few carried the constant personal risk that came with working in the brothels scattered across Wild West towns. These women faced threats that went far beyond what any cowboy or lawman encountered on their worst days. The reality was brutal and unforgiving. Violence from customers wasn't rare, it was expected. Men who'd been drinking, gambling, or just received bad news often took their anger out on whoever was closest. A disagreement over price could turn into a beating. Jealous wives sometimes showed up with guns. Rival establishments sent troublemakers to cause problems. Makes sense that most of these women learned to handle weapons themselves, right? Disease spread like wildfire in cramped quarters where sanitation was practically non-existent. Cholera, typhoid and smallpox moved from person to person with deadly efficiency. Medical care, that was a luxury most couldn't afford, and even if they could, frontier doctors knew little about treating the illnesses that plagued these establishments. Many women died young from diseases that would be easily treatable today. The physical dangers were matched by psychological ones. Most had arrived at this work not by choice, but by desperation, economic hardship, family tragedy, or simply being abandoned in a frontier town with no money left. Few alternatives. Some were as young as 14 or 15, trying to survive in places where survival meant accepting whatever work paid enough to eat. Then there were the working conditions themselves. Buildings were often hastily constructed fire traps with thin walls and poor ventilation. Fights broke out regularly, and when they did, everyone in the building was at risk. Gunshots through walls weren't uncommon. Fires started by overturned oil lamps or carelessly thrown cigarettes could consume an entire building in minutes. Law enforcement offered little protection. Most sheriffs and marshals saw these establishments as necessary evils but didn't much care what happened inside them. If a woman was beaten, robbed or worse, reporting it to the authorities was often useless. Some lawmen were customers themselves, creating obvious conflicts of interest when problems arose. Competition between establishments could turn deadly. Madams sometimes hired men to intimidate workers at rival houses. Poisoning wasn't unheard of, slipping something dangerous into a competitor's drink or food. Business disputes that would be settled in courtrooms back east were handled with knives and guns on the frontier. The women who survived longest were those who developed their own protection networks. They looked out for each other, shared information about dangerous customers, and sometimes pooled resources to higher security. Some learned to shoot with deadly accuracy. Others mastered the art of reading people quickly, spotting trouble before it escalated. But here's what's really striking about these dangerous lives. Many of these women showed incredible resilience and business savvy. Some saved every penny they could, eventually buying their own establishments or moving into other businesses. A few became powerful figures in frontier towns, wielding influence that extended far beyond their original work. They understood money, knew how to handle difficult people, and had survival instincts sharper than most frontier businessmen. Weather added another layer of risk. Poorly heated buildings during harsh winters meant choosing between freezing or risking fires from dangerous heating methods. Summer heat in unventilated rooms created breeding grounds for disease. Flash floods could trap everyone inside, and tornadoes offered no safe shelter in these flimsy structures. The isolation of many frontier towns made everything worse. Help was often days or weeks away. If someone got seriously ill or injured, there might be no doctor within 100 miles. Emergency supplies were non-existent. Even basic items like clean bandages or medicine had to be ordered from distant cities and might take months to arrive. Despite all these dangers, some women thrived in ways that would have been impossible in more civilized society. The frontier's loose social rules meant that a clever, tough woman could accumulate wealth and influence that would have been denied to her anywhere else. Some became real estate investors, saloon owners, or even town founders. The weird part: many frontier towns depended on these establishments more than anyone wanted to admit. They provided social centers, unofficial banking services, and information networks that kept communities connected. The women who worked there often knew more about what was happening in town than the mayor or sheriff did. These dangerous jobs created their own underground economy. Information was currency. Knowing which travelers carried money, which local businessmen were having financial troubles, or which lawmen could be bought was valuable knowledge that could mean the difference between survival and disaster. Their daily existence required constant vigilance that would exhaust most people. Every customer was a potential threat. Every knock on the door could bring violence or law enforcement raids. Every day meant navigating social dynamics that could turn deadly without warning. The skills required for survival in this work, reading people, handling money, managing conflict, and staying alert to danger would prove valuable for those who eventually moved on to other frontier occupations, including some surprisingly respectable ones that required similar street smarts and courage. Taking care of sheep sounds peaceful, doesn't it? Rolling green hills, fluffy white animals, maybe a shepherd's crook, and some quiet time under the stars. Well, throw that fantasy out the window. Sheep herding in the Wild West was about as peaceful as a tornado in a dynamite factory. These herders faced dangers that would make a gunslinger think twice. Wolves prowled the darkness like furry death machines, their yellow eyes scanning for the weakest sheep. Coyotes worked in packs, coordinating attacks with military precision. A single night could wipe out dozens of animals and months of income. Herders slept with one eye open and rifles loaded because predators didn't take holidays, but wild animals were just the opening act. The real show started when cattle ranchers decided sheep didn't belong on their land. Range wars erupted across the West, pitting cowboy against shepherd in bloody feuds that lasted for years. Cowboys claimed sheep ruined grazing land by eating grass down to the roots. Sheep herders argued they had just as much right to public lands. The argument usually got settled with bullets rather than handshakes. These weren't polite disagreements over property lines. Ranchers poisoned water sources, burned sheep camps, and sometimes shot herders on sight. In Wyoming, cattlemen hired gunfighters to eliminate entire flocks. Thousands of sheep died in coordinated attacks that resembled military campaigns more than neighborly disputes. Makes sense, right? When money and survival were on the line, people got creative with violence. Then there's the isolation factor that drove many herders completely insane. While cowboys worked in groups during cattle drives, sheep herders spent months alone with nothing but woolly companions for conversation. They talked to their dogs, sang to their flocks, and sometimes started hearing voices in the wind. Some herders went months without seeing another human face. The loneliness ate at their minds, like acid on metal. Weather turned these already dangerous jobs into death sentences. Blizzards struck without warning, burying entire flocks under tons of snow. Herders had two choices: abandon their sheep and survive, or stay with the flock and freeze to death. Many chose loyalty over life. Spring thaws revealed frozen shepherds still clutching their staffs, surrounded by wool-covered ice sculptures that used to be livestock. Summer brought different nightmares. Heat waves cooked animals alive in their own wool coats. Water sources dried up, forcing desperate herders to drive their flocks across scorching desert terrain. Sheep collapsed by the hundreds, their tongues swollen and black. Herders watched their investments literally melt away under the merciless sun. Poisonous plants added another layer of deadly complexity to the job. Sheep would munch on pretty flowers that contained enough toxins to kill a horse. Larkspur, death camas, and locaweed grew wild across grazing lands, creating botanical minefields that could wipe out entire flocks overnight. Experienced herders learned to identify dozens of killer plants, but sheep had terrible judgment about their lunch choices. The weird part is how these herders developed their own unique culture in response to all this danger. Basque immigrants brought ancient techniques from European mountains, using trained dogs that could outthink most humans. These border collies became legendary for their intelligence and loyalty, often saving both sheep and shepherds from disaster. A good sheepdog was worth more than gold in frontier country. Competition between herding operations got vicious fast. Rival herders would steal sheep, sabotage camps, or spread disease through flocks. Some used trained dogs to stampede competitors' animals off cliffs or into rivers. Business rivalries turned into blood feuds that passed down through generations like cursed family heirlooms. Let's not forget the technical challenges that made every day a survival test. Herders needed to know veterinary medicine, weather prediction, animal psychology, and wilderness navigation. They performed surgery on sick sheep using pocket knives and prayer. They delivered lambs during midnight blizzards and treated injuries with whatever materials they could scrounge up. Equipment failures could mean death for both herder and flock. Broken saddles left men stranded miles from help. Failed water containers meant watching animals die of thirst. Even something simple like a torn boot could lead to frostbite and amputation in winter conditions. The really crazy part: many herders actually loved this dangerous lifestyle. They developed deep bonds with their animals and felt genuine pride in their work. Some became wealthy enough to buy ranches of their own, transforming from hired hands into land barons. Others died broke and alone, their bones scattered across remote grazing lands. These sheep herders weren't just tending livestock, They were pioneering some of America's most hostile territory. Their willingness to face isolation, violence, and natural disasters helped settle the West, one woolly step at a time. But while herders battled predators and rival ranchers in remote wilderness, other frontier workers faced completely different dangers in town centers. Some jobs required steady hands and sharp tools working inches from people's faces. The barber chair in a Wild West town wasn't just where you got a shave and a haircut. It doubled as a dentist chair, a surgeon's table, and sometimes even an undertaker's prep station. When the town doctor was miles away or dead drunk, the local barber became the go-to guy for everything from extracting bullets to pulling rotten teeth. These weren't your modern barbers with fancy training. Most learned their trade by watching someone else for a few weeks, then hanging up their own striped pole. But the real shock came when desperate folks stumbled through the door with injuries that had nothing to do with hair. A cowboy with a knife wound, a miner with a mangled hand, or a saloon girl with a broken nose all ended up in that same leather chair where someone got a trim an hour earlier. The tools were terrifying by today's standards. The same scissors used to cut hair doubled as surgical instruments. Razors meant for shaving became scalpels for digging out splinters or cutting away infected skin. Barbers would heat their blade over a candle flame thinking that somehow made it clean. They had no idea about germs or infection, just the basic notion that hot metal might work better than cold. Tooth extraction was probably the most common medical service barbers provided. People's teeth rotted fast in the Wild West thanks to poor diet and zero dental care. When the pain became unbearable, they'd stumble into the barber shop and beg for relief. The barber would grab his strongest pliers, maybe give the patient a shot of whiskey, and yank away. No Novocaine, no proper anesthesia, just raw determination and alcohol. The success rate was about what you'd expect. Sometimes the tooth came out clean, other times it shattered, leaving infected fragments in the gum. Plenty of patients passed out from the pain, which actually made the barber's job easier, but infections from dirty tools killed more people than anyone wants to admit. Then there were the bullet wounds. Cowboys, lawmen, and outlaws all seemed to attract lead, and when they couldn't make it to a real doctor, the barbershop became an emergency room. Barbers learned to dig bullets out of shoulders, arms and legs using whatever they had handy. Some kept a special set of long tweezers just for this purpose. Others improvised with regular barbering tools. The weird part is how barbers advertised these services. Signs outside shops would read haircuts, shaves, teeth pulled, and surgery, like it was all the same skill set. Some barbers got surprisingly good at basic medical procedures through sheer practice. Others probably killed more people than they helped. But nobody kept official records of barbershop fatalities. Barbershops also served as the town's information center. While working on someone's hair, barbers heard every piece of gossip, every rumor, and every secret. They knew who was cheating at cards, which rancher was going broke, and when the next stagecoach full of money was arriving. This made them valuable to outlaws and lawmen alike, but also put them in danger when they knew too much. Some barbers carried guns while they worked, not because they expected trouble during a haircut, but because their shops were prime targets for robbers who knew barbers often kept cash from both haircuts and medical services. Plus, all those razors and scissors made for decent weapons in a pinch. The working conditions were brutal. Barbershops had poor ventilation, so they were constantly filled with smoke from heating tools and sterilizing equipment. The smell of burning hair mixed with blood, infection, and whatever chemicals they used for cleaning. Many barbers developed lung problems from breathing this toxic air day after day. Accidents happened constantly. Barbers cut themselves on their own tools, burned their hands on hot metal, and sometimes got injured by panicking patients. A cowboy getting a tooth pulled might throw a punch without thinking. Someone getting a bullet dug out might thrash around and knock the barber into his own equipment. But perhaps the most dangerous part was the responsibility. When someone died during a medical procedure, the barber faced angry family members, suspicious lawmen, and sometimes lynch mobs. Even if the person was dying anyway, the barber got blamed for not saving them. Some were run out of town, or worse when too many patients died under their care. The strangest stories come from barbers who actually got good at medicine. A few became legendary for their surgical skills, even attracting patients from neighboring towns. These barber surgeons sometimes made more money from medical work than haircuts, creating a bizarre career path that existed nowhere else in America. What made this job even more fascinating was how it connected to every other dangerous profession in the West. The same barber might patch up a wounded sheriff in the morning, give a trim to a suspected outlaw in the afternoon, and pull a tooth for a stagecoach driver at night. Each customer brought their own stories of danger and survival. While barbers were saving lives with questionable medical skills, other frontier workers were risking their own lives trying to keep communication flowing across the vast wilderness. Telegraph wires stretched across America like a massive spider web, carrying messages that could mean the difference between life and death. But someone had to tap out those crucial dots and dashes. Enter the telegrapher, a job that sounds peaceful until you realize one wrong tap could get people killed. These folks sat hunched over clicking machines in tiny wooden shacks, often miles from the nearest town. Their fingers danced across telegraph keys, translating urgent messages into Morse code. ... Each combination meant something specific, and getting it wrong wasn't just embarrassing, it was deadly. Here's the thing about being a frontier telegrapher: mistakes had consequences that rippled across entire territories. A single wrong letter in a message about an approaching outlaw gang could send lawmen racing to the wrong town. Meanwhile, the real target got robbed blind, while help headed the opposite direction. The telegrapher who messed up that message, he'd carry that weight for the rest of his life, assuming he lived through the aftermath. Then there's the isolation factor. Most telegraph stations were planted in the middle of nowhere, connecting distant towns and railroad stops. The telegrapher might go weeks without seeing another human face. Just him, his clicking machine, and whatever wildlife decided to pay a visit. Bears occasionally wandered into stations looking for food. Wolves howled outside during winter nights. Some telegraphers went a little crazy from the loneliness, talking to their equipment like it was a person. But the real danger came from the equipment itself. Those early telegraph machines weren't exactly built with safety in mind. Electrical shocks were common, especially during thunderstorms when lightning could travel down the wires. More than one telegrapher got zapped while trying to send an important message during bad weather. The smart ones learned to disconnect during storms, but urgent messages couldn't always wait for clear skies. The pressure was incredible too. News of train robberies, Indian attacks, or natural disasters often came through telegraph lines first. A telegrapher receiving word of a flash flood had to get that warning out fast, even if his hands were shaking from too much coffee and not enough sleep. People downstream were counting on his accuracy, though they'd never know his name. Speaking of names, most telegraphers remained anonymous heroes. They rarely got credit when their quick thinking saved lives, but they sure caught hell when things went wrong. A delayed message about a bank robbery could let outlaws escape. A garbled transmission about troop movements might leave soldiers vulnerable to attack. The blame always seemed to land on the poor guy with the telegraph key. Night shifts were the worst. Sitting alone in a cramped station lit by a single oil lamp, listening for incoming messages through the static and interference. Every creak of the building sounded like footsteps. Every animal noise outside could be trouble approaching. Outlaws knew that cutting telegraph lines or eliminating the operator could buy them precious time during robberies or escapes. Some telegraphers developed their own code systems with neighboring stations, little personal touches that helped verify messages were legitimate. A fake message from bandits trying to misdirect lawmen might have perfect Morse code, but miss these subtle authenticators. Smart telegraphers learned to spot these tricks, but it took experience most didn't live long enough to gain. The equipment itself was temperamental, wires snapped in high winds, connections corroded in bad weather, parts wore out with no repair shops for hundreds of miles. A telegrapher had to be part operator, part electrician and part mechanic. When the machine broke down during a crisis, he'd work frantically to fix it while knowing that every lost minute might cost lives somewhere down the line. Weather added another layer of danger. Desert stations baked during summer days, leaving operators dizzy from heat exhaustion while trying to maintain focus on important messages. Mountain stations got buried in snow, with telegraphers sometimes trapped for weeks. Prairie stations faced tornadoes that could flatten the building while the operator was still inside, desperately trying to warn other towns about the approaching storm. Yet these isolated workers became the nervous system of the expanding frontier. They passed along everything from routine business messages to desperate pleas for help. A crying woman begging for a doctor, a sheriff requesting backup before a showdown, a railroad dispatcher coordinating train schedules to prevent deadly collisions. Each message carried someone's hopes, fears, or survival. The most experienced telegraphers developed an almost supernatural ability to recognize other operators by their fist, the unique rhythm and timing of how they tapped out Morse code. Like handwriting, every operator had a distinctive style. This skill helped verify authentic messages and spot imposters trying to send false information. But even the best telegraphers couldn't escape the fundamental truth of their profession. They held other people's fates in their fingertips. While lawmen faced danger with guns drawn and cowboys wrestled with stampeding cattle, telegraphers fought their battles one dot and dash at a time. And just like those other dangerous frontier jobs, being handy with tools was only half the battle in the Wild West. Working as a blacksmith in the Wild West meant dancing with fire every single day. The forge burned at temperatures over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt copper coins in seconds. Sparks flew constantly, landing on clothes, skin, and anything combustible nearby. One careless move could turn a workshop into an inferno. The daily routine started before dawn. Blacksmiths had to build up their coal fires, pump the bellows until flames roared white-hot, then grab red-hot iron with nothing but basic tongs. Burns weren't a possibility, they were guaranteed. Most smiths had scars covering their arms like a roadmap of mishaps. Third-degree burns happened so often that many didn't even bother seeing a doctor anymore. But the real danger came from the horses. Wild West horses weren't gentle farm animals broken to harness. These were half-wild mustangs. Spooked stallions and ornery mares that kicked first and asked questions later. Shoeing a horse meant crouching directly behind a 1,000-pound animal that could crush skulls with one well-placed hoof. Blacksmiths learned to read horse body language better than most people read books, because missing the warning signs could mean death. Then there's the equipment itself. Primitive and deadly. Hammers weighed up to 4 pounds swung with enough force to shatter bones. Miss the anvil and hit your hand? Say goodbye to fingers. The bellows required constant pumping to keep fires hot, straining backs and shoulders until many smiths walked permanently hunched over. Coal smoke filled workshops with toxic fumes that damaged lungs over time. What made things worse was the sheer variety of dangerous tasks frontier blacksmiths handled. They weren't just making horseshoes and nails. Cowboys needed spurs sharp enough to control bucking broncos. Miners required pickaxes that could break granite. Lawmen ordered custom gun parts that had to be perfectly crafted, or weapons would explode in their hands. One miscalculation while forging a rifle barrel could kill the customer and destroy the smith's reputation forever. The workspace itself was a death trap waiting to happen. Wooden floors soaked with oil caught fire easily. Tools scattered everywhere created tripping hazards in dim light. Water barrels used for quenching hot metal often ran low during droughts, forcing smiths to work without proper cooling methods. The combination of extreme heat, toxic smoke and poor ventilation turned many workshops into suffocating hellholes. Eye injuries plagued blacksmiths constantly. Flying metal fragments, coal dust and bright forge flames damaged vision over time. Many experienced smiths worked half-blind, relying on feel and sound to know when iron reached the right temperature. Protective eyewear didn't exist, so permanent eye damage was just another occupational hazard they accepted. Emergency medical situations fell on blacksmiths regularly too. When the town doctor wasn't available, people brought injured horses, sick cattle, and sometimes even wounded humans to the blacksmith shop. Smiths learned to pull teeth, set broken bones and perform crude surgeries using the same tools they used for metalwork. Sterilization meant heating instruments in the forge and hoping for the best. The physical toll was brutal. Swinging heavy hammers for 12 hours a day built incredible arm strength but destroyed joints. The constant bending over anvils curved spines permanently. Heat exhaustion during summer months killed weaker men outright. Dehydration was constant since drinking water near the forge often became too hot to swallow. Violence sometimes spilled into blacksmith shops when disputes over bills or shoddy work escalated. An angry cowboy with a gun could turn a simple business disagreement deadly fast. Smiths learned to keep weapons handy and position themselves near exits when dealing with difficult customers. Some shops became informal meeting places where tensions between ranchers, miners, and townsfolk boiled over into fistfights or worse. The financial pressure added another layer of stress. Blacksmiths competed for customers in small frontier towns where business was unpredictable. A bad batch of horseshoes or a broken wagon wheel repair could ruin their reputation instantly. Many worked on credit, waiting months for payment while still needing to buy expensive coal and iron supplies up front. Natural disasters hit blacksmith shops particularly hard. Prairie fires could destroy entire workshops in minutes. Flash floods rusted tools and equipment beyond repair. Winter blizzards made it impossible to keep forges hot enough to work, cutting off income for weeks at a time. Despite all these dangers, blacksmiths were absolutely essential to frontier life. Every nail, horseshoe, tool, and metal implement depended on their skills. Towns without blacksmiths simply couldn't survive. The combination of extreme skill requirements and life-threatening working conditions meant that experienced smiths could name their price if they lived long enough to build a reputation. Yet even the most careful blacksmiths faced one constant threat: they couldn't control other people's mistakes. When poorly maintained stagecoaches broke down or badly forged gun parts failed, guess who got blamed? But speaking of people whose mistakes could prove even more costly, prison guards dealt with failures that could literally set dangerous criminals loose on entire communities. Prison guards in the Wild West had one of the most thankless jobs in America. While blacksmiths dealt with hot metal and flying sparks, guards faced something far more unpredictable: desperate men with nothing left to lose. Most frontier jails weren't the stone fortresses you see in movies. They were thrown together wooden buildings with iron bars that a determined prisoner could sometimes bend or break. The locks, half of them could be picked with a hairpin. Some doors were held shut with nothing more than a heavy wooden beam across the front. Prison security was more like a suggestion than a guarantee. Guards typically worked alone or in pairs, watching over dozens of prisoners. The math never worked in their favor. One guard might supervise 20 outlaws, cattle rustlers, and murderers packed into cells designed for half that number. When tensions flared, which happened almost daily, guards had to think fast or risk getting overwhelmed. Escape attempts weren't rare events. They were Tuesday afternoons. Prisoners would dig tunnels under walls, squeeze through loose bars, or simply rush the guard during mealtime. Some got creative, pretending to be sick to lure guards close enough to grab their keys. Others would start fights as distractions while their buddies worked on the locks. Then there's the weapon situation, which was often laughable. Many guards carried a single revolver, and maybe a shotgun if they were lucky. Some smaller towns couldn't afford to arm their guards properly, leaving them with old rifles that jammed half the time. A few guards worked completely unarmed, relying on intimidation and quick talking to keep order. That strategy worked about as well as you'd expect. The worst part wasn't the prisoners inside, it was the friends outside. Gang members regularly tried to break their buddies out of jail, sometimes with dynamite. These weren't quiet midnight operations either. Armed gangs would ride into town, guns blazing, ready to shoot anyone who got in their way. Guards found themselves in full-scale gunfights, often outnumbered 10 to 1. Prison riots were another nightmare altogether. When dozens of angry prisoners decided they'd had enough, guards had few options. No backup was coming. The nearest help might be days away. Some guards managed to restore order through sheer grit and intimidation. Others weren't so fortunate, getting beaten unconscious or worse during the chaos. Food became a daily battle too. Prisoners complained constantly about the quality, which was admittedly terrible. Beans, hard bread, and water made up most meals. Guards had to serve this slop while staying alert for improvised weapons made from spoons or tin plates. Mealtime was when most attacks happened because it was the only time cell doors opened regularly. Medical emergencies added another layer of danger. When a prisoner got sick or injured, guards faced an impossible choice: ignore the problem and risk a death on their watch, or enter the cell to help and possibly walk into a trap. Many guards learned basic first aid out of necessity, becoming part-time doctors whether they wanted to or not. Some jails had what they called special prisoners, notorious outlaws whose names alone drew trouble. Famous bank robbers or gunfighters attracted bounty hunters, lynch mobs, and rival gangs. Guards protecting these high-value prisoners lived in constant fear of vigilante justice. Angry townspeople sometimes gathered outside jails, demanding immediate hangings without trials. Night shifts were particularly brutal. Darkness gave prisoners cover for escape attempts, and outside gangs opportunities for rescue missions. Guards often worked 16-hour shifts because there simply weren't enough men willing to do the job. Exhaustion made them sloppy, and sloppy guards didn't last long. The pay was another joke entirely. Most guards earned less than bartenders or store clerks, despite facing life-threatening situations daily. Towns struggled to find anyone willing to take the job, often settling for whoever showed up. Some guards were former outlaws themselves, which created its own problems when they recognized old partners behind bars. Weather made everything worse. Summer heat turned small jails into ovens, making prisoners irritable and violent. Winter cold froze locks and made everything harder to manage. During storms, leaky roofs and flooding added misery to an already dangerous situation. But perhaps the strangest challenge was boredom. Between escape attempts and riots, guards spent long hours with nothing to do but watch dangerous men pace around small cells. The psychological pressure was enormous, knowing that at any moment things could explode into violence. Despite all these hazards, some guards developed reputations as tough, fair men who could handle the worst criminals. They earned respect through consistency and courage, proving that even in the most dangerous jobs, character mattered. While guards struggled to keep dangerous men locked up, another group of frontier workers faced different risks while trying to inform the public about all this chaos. Newspaper reporters had to get close enough to these stories to write about them, and that created its own unique brand of danger. Prison guards weren't exactly living the quiet life on the frontier. While today's correctional officers have backup, cameras and proper protocols, Wild West guards watched over dangerous criminals with nothing but their wits and maybe a rusty pistol. Most frontier jails looked more like chicken coops than secure facilities. Wooden bars, dirt floors and locks that could be picked with a hairpin. Guards basically babysat murderers and thieves in buildings that wouldn't keep out a determined raccoon. The numbers were all wrong from the start. One guard might watch 15 prisoners, including bank robbers, cattle rustlers, and men who'd killed for sport. These weren't petty thieves serving 30 days for stealing bread. These were hardened criminals who knew their next stop was probably a rope around their neck. Desperation made them incredibly dangerous, and they had nothing left to lose. Escape attempts happened almost weekly in most frontier towns. Prisoners would dig tunnels with spoons, saw through bars with smuggled files, or simply overpower guards during mealtime. Some guards learned to sleep with one eye open because inmates had been known to grab keys through the bars while guards dozed. The smart guards never got too comfortable, but comfort was hard to avoid when you're pulling 12-hour shifts in a stuffy jailhouse. Then there were the outside threats that most people forget about. Gangs didn't abandon their members just because they got caught. Jesse James's crew, for instance, had a reputation for busting their buddies out of jail using dynamite and superior firepower. Guards would hear horses approaching at night and wonder if tonight was the night they'd face down a dozen armed outlaws. Some guards quit the moment they heard certain notorious names on their prisoner list. Mob justice presented another terrifying challenge. When a particularly hated criminal got arrested, angry townspeople sometimes decided the legal system was moving too slowly. They'd show up with torches and rope, demanding the prisoner be handed over immediately. Guards found themselves caught between a rock and a hard place. Either face down an angry mob, or let them lynch someone in custody. Either choice could get you killed. The isolation made everything worse. Many frontier jails sat on the edge of town, meaning guards worked alone for hours without any possible backup. If trouble started, there was no calling for help, no radio, no telephone, no way to summon assistance. Guards had to handle riots, escape attempts, and armed attacks completely solo. The job attracted either very brave men or very desperate ones. Payment was another joke entirely. Most guards earned less than saloon sweepers, despite risking their lives daily. Towns often couldn't afford proper weapons or equipment for their guards, so many bought their own guns and handcuffs. Some guards supplemented their income by doubling as undertakers, since they had plenty of practice dealing with dead bodies. Weaponry was primitive compared to what prisoners sometimes smuggled in. While a guard might have a single-shot pistol, prisoners could have derringers hidden in their boots, knives in their belt buckles, or even small explosives passed through visitors. Searches were basic and often ineffective. Prisoners got creative with hiding weapons, and guards stayed constantly on edge, wondering what surprises awaited them. The psychological pressure wore down even the toughest guards. Living daily with men who'd slit your throat for entertainment took a mental toll. Many guards developed drinking problems, or became paranoid about everyone around them. Some guards became as hard and violent as the prisoners they watched, figuring brutality was the only language these men understood. Weather made bad situations worse. Summer heat turned small jails into ovens, making prisoners irritable and dangerous. Winter cold froze locks solid and made guards sluggish when they needed to react quickly. Prisoners sometimes used weather to their advantage, starting fights during thunderstorms when the noise would cover escape attempts. Yet some guards developed almost supernatural instincts for trouble. They could sense when prisoners were planning something just by watching body language and listening to changes in conversation patterns. These veteran guards learned tricks like rattling keys loudly when walking past cells to wake up any prisoners trying to work on escape plans. The good guards developed networks of informants among prisoners, trading better food or small privileges for information about planned troubles. The really smart guards understood that respect, not fear, kept them alive. Brutal guards often ended up dead, while those who treated prisoners fairly but firmly lasted longer. Still, even the best guards knew that luck played a huge role in survival. One bad night, one successful escape, one gang rescue attempt could end everything in seconds. The stories these guards could tell would make your hair stand on end. But speaking of dangerous jobs that required nerves of steel, the men who reported on all this chaos faced their own unique set of deadly challenges in the Wild West. When most folks think about dangerous Wild West jobs, they picture gunfighters and outlaws blazing away at each other. But there's a profession that might have been even more terrifying, being the person everyone expected to fix the damage afterward. Doctors and dentists in frontier towns faced horrors that would make modern medical professionals quit on the spot. These weren't your typical physicians with fancy degrees and sterile hospitals. Most frontier doctors learned their trade through trial and error, often with deadly consequences. Some had read a medical book or two, others just claimed they knew what they were doing, and hoped for the best. When someone stumbled into town with a bullet in their gut, there wasn't time to check credentials. The tools available would make you cringe. Doctors performed surgery with kitchen knives, carpenter's saws, and whatever sharp objects they could sterilize over an open flame. Forget about proper operating rooms. Most procedures happened on saloon tables, in hotel rooms, or right there in the dirt where the patient fell. One frontier doctor in Kansas reportedly performed over 30 amputations using nothing but a rusty saw and a bottle of whiskey for both patient and surgeon. Then there's the small matter of anesthesia. It didn't exist on most frontiers. Patients bit down on leather straps or wooden sticks while doctors dug bullets out of their bodies. The lucky ones passed out from pain. The unlucky ones stayed conscious through the entire ordeal, screaming loud enough to wake the dead. Some doctors gave patients large quantities of alcohol, but that created its own problems during surgery. Infection killed more people than bullets ever did. Doctors didn't understand germs yet, so they rarely washed their hands between patients. The same bloody apron might be worn for weeks. Surgical instruments got a quick wipe down if they were lucky. Many patients survived the initial surgery only to die days later from infections that turned their wounds green and black. But the real challenge wasn't just the medical procedures, it was getting to patients in the first place. Frontier doctors traveled hundreds of miles on horseback through blizzards, floods, and hostile territory to reach someone who might already be dead by the time they arrived. They carried their entire medical practice in saddlebags, racing against time and weather to save lives. Dentists faced their own unique brand of nightmare. Tooth extraction was basically legalized torture. They used pliers designed for pulling nails, not teeth. Patients sat in regular chairs while dentists yanked and twisted until something gave way. Sometimes it was the tooth, sometimes it was the patient's jaw. The screaming could be heard 3 blocks away, which wasn't great advertising for the dental practice. Many frontier dentists were actually barbers who decided to expand their services. Makes sense, right? They already had sharp tools and steady hands. The transition from cutting hair to pulling teeth seemed natural enough. Unfortunately, haircuts rarely resulted in death from blood loss, but dental work often did. Payment presented another serious problem. Patients didn't always survive to pay their bills. Others simply refused to pay, especially if the treatment went badly. One doctor in Colorado reportedly accepted payment in the form of livestock, gold dust, whiskey, and once a deed to a supposedly valuable mine that turned out to be worthless rock. The psychological toll was enormous. These medical professionals watched patients die from conditions that would be easily treatable today. They performed procedures knowing they were probably causing more harm than good, but having no alternatives. Many turned to heavy drinking to cope with the constant failure and death surrounding their practice. Some frontier doctors became local legends, not for their medical skills but for their creativity under pressure. Doc Holliday, the famous gunfighter, was actually a trained dentist before he took up gambling and shooting people. He probably caused less suffering with his gun than with his dental tools. Female doctors and nurses faced additional dangers beyond medical challenges. They were rare and often viewed with suspicion. Some towns refused to accept female medical practitioners, forcing them to disguise themselves or work in secret. Those who persevered often became beloved community figures, but the road was incredibly difficult. The strangest part might be that many frontier doctors and dentists genuinely tried to help people despite impossible conditions. They innovated constantly, developing new techniques and improvising solutions with whatever materials they could find. Some of their methods, born from desperation, actually advanced medical knowledge. Medicine in the Wild West was essentially gambling with human lives. Every patient was a roll of the dice, and the house usually won. Yet these medical pioneers laid the groundwork for better healthcare systems that would eventually follow civilization westward. While doctors and dentists struggled to save lives with primitive tools and limited knowledge, another group of professionals worked to bridge the dangerous gaps between different cultures and territories. These guides and interpreters faced their own deadly challenges in the untamed frontier. Being a town scout meant you had one of the strangest jobs in the Wild West. Half the time, you were leading nervous settlers through dangerous territory they'd never seen before. The other half, you were sitting between angry groups of people who couldn't understand each other and desperately hoping your translation skills would prevent a massacre. These weren't your typical guides with a compass and a smile. Town scouts were survival experts who knew every trail, water source, and hiding spot across hundreds of miles of frontier land. They had to read weather patterns, spot trouble from miles away, and keep entire wagon trains alive while crossing landscapes that could kill you in a dozen different ways. But here's the twist. Many of the best scouts were Native Americans or people of mixed heritage who found themselves caught between two worlds that often wanted to destroy each other. The job required an almost impossible combination of skills. You needed to speak multiple tribal languages fluently, understand the subtle differences between peaceful gestures and war signals, and navigate complex political situations where one wrong word could spark a conflict. Some scouts spoke 5 or 6 different languages, switching between English, Spanish, and various tribal dialects depending on who they were talking to that day. Then there's the pressure of being responsible for other people's lives. When you're guiding a wagon train of families across unmarked territory, every decision matters. Choose the wrong river crossing, and people drown. Miss the signs of an approaching storm, and everyone gets caught in deadly weather. Lead settlers into territory claimed by hostile tribes, and you've just started a fight that could get everyone killed. Indian interpreters faced even stranger challenges. They often worked for the US government during treaty negotiations, trying to translate not just words but entirely different ways of thinking about land, ownership, and law. Imagine trying to explain to a Lakota chief why the government thinks it can sell land that the tribe considers sacred, or explaining to a cavalry officer why a particular valley can't be settled because it's a burial ground. The cultural tightrope these interpreters walked was incredibly dangerous. Tribes sometimes viewed them as traitors for working with white settlers. White communities often didn't trust them because of their native heritage. They lived in constant danger of being rejected by both sides, which in the Wild West often meant being left to survive completely alone. Many scouts developed their own unique methods for staying alive. Some would deliberately travel with multiple groups, never staying loyal to any one side for too long. Others became masters of reading body language and tone, able to sense when a peaceful meeting was about to turn violent. The smart ones always knew where the nearest exit was and how to reach their horse quickly. What made the job even more complex was that the political situation changed constantly. A tribe that was friendly last month might be at war this month because of something that happened 2 territories away. A safe route through the mountains could become a death trap overnight if tensions escalated between different groups. Scouts had to stay informed about conflicts, alliances, and grudges across vast areas of the frontier. Some of these scouts became legendary figures. They earned reputations for being able to find anyone, anywhere, or for successfully negotiating impossible situations. A few could walk into hostile territory unarmed and walk out with a peace agreement. Others were known for their ability to track people across terrain where most folks couldn't even find their own footprints. But the work took a serious toll. Many scouts suffered from what we'd now recognize as severe stress from constantly living in high-danger situations. They developed habits like sleeping with one eye open, never sitting with their back to a door, and always having an escape route planned. The successful ones learned to read people incredibly well, but it also meant they struggled to trust anyone completely. The loneliness was brutal too. Scouts often spent weeks alone in the wilderness, then days with people who might turn hostile at any moment. They rarely had anyone they could completely relax around. Even when they were in friendly towns, they were usually planning their next dangerous journey into unknown territory. Weather added another layer of danger. Scouts couldn't wait for perfect conditions. If settlers needed guidance or a treaty meeting was scheduled, they had to travel regardless of blizzards, flash floods, or extreme heat. They learned to survive in conditions that would kill most people, but that knowledge came from experience that nearly killed them first. The equipment they carried tells its own story. Most scouts traveled light, but carried items that could serve multiple purposes. A blanket that could also be a signal. A knife that worked for cutting food, self-defense, and emergency medical procedures. Every item had to earn its place because extra weight could mean the difference between outrunning trouble and becoming a victim of it. While scouts navigated the dangers of the frontier, other brave souls were taking on different kinds of risks back in the growing towns and settlements. Most people today complain about their office jobs being boring. Deadlines stress them out. Bad coffee ruins their morning. Their biggest workplace danger might be a paper cut, or someone microwaving fish in the break room. But here's the thing that makes Wild West jobs so captivating. These folks faced death before lunch and still showed up the next day. Every single profession we've explored created something bigger than just survival stories. Take the Pony Express riders who galloped across hostile territory. Their 2-year operation proved that fast communication could work across vast distances. Without those teenage daredevils risking their necks, the transcontinental telegraph might have taken years longer to build. The entire concept of rapid mail service, born from kids dodging bullets on horseback. Railroad workers blasting through mountains with unstable dynamite weren't just building tracks. They were stitching a fractured nation back together after the Civil War. Every tunnel they carved through solid rock, every bridge they threw across deadly gorges, connected isolated communities to the growing American economy. Those Irish and Chinese immigrants who died in avalanches and explosions, they literally moved mountains so future generations could travel safely. Then there's the unexpected ripple effects nobody saw coming. Undertakers dealing with constant violence didn't just bury bodies. They pioneered embalming techniques that revolutionized funeral practices nationwide. Frontier doctors performing surgery with whiskey and dirty knives developed field medicine methods that military medics still use today. Even saloon keepers managing nightly brawls helped establish crowd control tactics that modern bouncers would recognize. But why do these dangerous jobs capture our imagination more than safer occupations from the same era? Well, danger reveals character like nothing else can. A store clerk might be honest or dishonest, but you'd never know without extreme circumstances. A sheriff facing down 5 armed outlaws, his true nature gets exposed real quick. These high-stakes situations stripped away pretense and showed people's raw courage or cowardice. The mythology around these jobs grew partly because survivors had incredible stories to tell. A railroad engineer who lived through 3 train robberies and a bridge collapse didn't chat about boring weather at the local saloon. His tales of near-death experiences entertained crowds for decades. Some stories got exaggerated with each telling, but the core truth remained: ordinary people did extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it. Modern safety regulations trace their roots directly back to Wild West tragedies. Mining companies started requiring better ventilation after too many workers died from poisonous gases. Telegraph companies began using safety equipment after linemen kept falling from poles. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration exists because 19th century workers paid with their lives to teach us what not to do. What's fascinating is how these dangerous professions created their own codes of conduct. Stagecoach drivers developed unofficial rules about protecting passengers during robberies. Buffalo hunters established territory agreements to prevent shooting wars. Even outlaws followed certain unwritten laws about which targets were acceptable and which crossed moral lines. Extreme danger forced communities to develop ethics quickly. The psychological appeal runs deeper than just adventure stories, though. These jobs represented ultimate freedom, alongside ultimate responsibility. A bounty hunter answered to nobody but himself, and faced the consequences alone when things went wrong. A cattle drive cowboy could quit any time, but abandoning the herd meant betraying his partners when they needed him most. That combination of liberty and accountability resonates with people trapped in modern bureaucracies where responsibility gets diffused across committees. Hollywood westerns captured some of this appeal but missed crucial elements. Movie gunfighters always seemed to enjoy the violence. Real frontier lawmen hated shooting people, and often struggled with guilt afterward. Films showed outlaws as either pure evil or romantic rebels. Actual bandits were usually desperate men making terrible choices for complex reasons involving poverty, war trauma, or family circumstances. The legacy of these professions shaped America's national character in ways we're still discovering. The idea that hard work and personal courage can overcome any obstacle, that came from watching miners strike it rich and railroad workers conquer impossible terrain. The belief that individuals should handle their own problems instead of waiting for help. Frontier life taught that lesson daily when the nearest assistance was hundreds of miles away. Even our modern entertainment industry owes debts to Wild West occupations. Video games where players face constant danger while building something valuable, that's basically the Buffalo Hunter experience with better graphics. Reality TV shows testing people's limits in harsh environments. Frontier life was the original survival challenge, except failure meant actual death instead of embarrassing elimination. These dangerous jobs continue fascinating us because they represent something we've largely lost, work that matters immediately and obviously. A telegraph operator's mistake could delay a cavalry rescue and cost lives. A doctor's skill meant the difference between a patient walking home or getting buried the next morning. The connection between effort and outcome was direct, visible, and undeniable. Their stories remind us that previous generations built our comfortable world by accepting risks we can barely comprehend today, and that courage often looks like simply showing up when others won't.